Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation. Today, we're going to be discussing Bidenomics, the political crisis facing the nation, and new theories of politics and society. Today, joined by Jeremiah, Emily, Brandon, Stanford, Vincent, and Miss Jamila from Illinois. And we'll start today's session with a presentation by Dr. Anthony Monteiro.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Jahan. I just want to kind of say a few things about the economy and, or the political economy and the measures being taken by the Biden administration, which is to say by the dominant sections of the ruling class to deal with what is a crisis. Let me begin by saying that last summer, about the same time, the US economy contracted by 30%, which is to say that it went into what was in effect a depression. Of course, this was set off or triggered by the necessity to shut down the economy because of the COVID virus. And we have not yet fully emerged from that crisis, although the economy is not in the same state it was last summer. But nonetheless, the ruling class, through Trump first and then now through Biden, committed itself to infusing trillions of dollars into the economy. If all of the spending bills that Biden is talking about, which would be something in the range of $6 trillion, and you add that to the Trump infusions of almost $3 trillion, we're talking of upwards of $9 trillion committed to stimulate the economy, the US economy, in less than a year. This is unprecedented in the history of the US economy and probably in the history of capitalism as a system. And I would just underline this, these commitments of trillions of dollars to save the economy and to avoid the possibility of millions of working people rising up in anger against the ruling class. There has been this attempt by spending, government spending, to, as Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum people say, to reset. It is a great capitalist reset at the same time. And of course, we saw that in this period of economic contraction, especially last year and even continuing, we saw a rise not only in unemployment, but of hunger in Texas and other places. You saw these long lines of people in their cars trying to get free food. There was a rise in homelessness, of drug addiction, and other social crises. This summer, that is right now, along with a very slow recovery, and I'm using language of the economists, a very slow comeback to where the economy was before the pandemic hit. What we are now facing, and April's economic numbers showed this, we're facing the possibility of inflation and what they call hyperinflation. And we've seen the effects of it already. Homes are rising in price. Lumber, copper, other precious metals, gas, even cars are going up in price. But what inflation represents at the end of the day is uncertainty. So in a lot of ways, we can say that we've gone from economic contraction last year to economic uncertainty now. At the same time, April's unemployment or employment numbers were far below what was expected. And this on top of inflation. But we can't even trust fully the unemployment numbers, the official unemployment numbers, which are grossly understated. I would argue in good times, US unemployment and underemployment is anywhere from 12 to 15%. So when they talk about full employment, we're talking in reality of 12 to 15% of the working class, people who want to work, either forced into unemployment, part-time employment, or totally outside of the labor force. And the numbers of people totally outside of the labor force who are not even counted is growing. And we see it in a city like Philadelphia. Many people these days talk about Kensington and that drug supermarket that is Kensington of homeless, addicted people. Well, there are Kensingtons all over the country. And these and the homeless in general are part of that group of people who are outside of the labor force. They're not even counted. The underemployed or part-time workers are people who work anywhere from 1 hour a week to less than 40 hours a week. So if you work 1 hour a week, you're not considered unemployed. So you can see that the statistics about the unemployment numbers are very much underestimated. And I would say that even in the best of times, 12 to 15% of the labor force or potential labor force is either outside of the labor force or working part-time, and not because they want to work part-time. The other thing is the gig economy, which means that more and more people are not working full-time. And they're in the gig economy usually because there's not employment in the regular economy. The other thing that we have to realize is that capitalist economies work through cycles. We call it the business cycle, or they call it the business cycle, through ups and downs, that recessions are built into the way capitalist economies work. Most recessions are not systemic crises. Since 1945, that is the end of World War II, up to 2004, I estimate that there were about 9 recessions. It's the way the economy works. And recessions damage the working class more than it damages the business or capitalist class. Often, people never fully recover from recessions. However, recessions are different than, let us say, the Great Depression of the 1930s, which was a systemic crisis. The system systemically was threatened by the Great Depression. 2008, the financial crisis, which led to what they call a Great Recession, which was in a lot of ways only surpassed by the Great Depression of the 1930s. The 2008-2009, quote, Great Recession, like the Great Depression of the 1930s, was a systemic crisis. It hit at the very foundation of the economic system, and therefore was not a normal recession, 9 of which occurred between 1945 and 2004. 12 years after the Great Recession, we have experienced another, quote, Great Recession, which looked more like the Great Depression of the 1930s than the 2008 Great Recession did. Which is to say, what we are experiencing in 2020, 2021 is not a normal recession. We are in the throes of a systemic crisis, which explains what I would consider the desperate emergency moves being made or taken by the ruling class to save the system, structurally and systemically, but also to save the system from the anger of the working people. Now, the other thing is, and this is why I use the word political economy, I prefer political economy to economics. Economics is an academic discipline which is new to economic theorizing. In other words, for most of the time, let us say from the 1600s up to the end of the 1900s, most what we call economists today refer to themselves and the discipline as political economy. The greatest political economist, of course, is Karl Marx. And what they all understood is that you could not separate economics from the state. I don't care whether it's Adam Smith or David Ricardo or William Petty or John Locke or whoever, and they're all, as you can see, they're all British, because the great political economists of capitalism have all been kind of British. But they saw the state as an integral part of economic processes. But when you get to Marx, you have introduced into the understanding of the economy the idea of class and class conflict. And that is what gives a newness and a dynamism and a more comprehensive understanding of the economy as a system. Okay? But Marx also introduces ideology into this. So in most socialist countries, just to give an example, the Soviet Union, let us say East Germany, certainly Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, they do not really have a discipline like sociology. They organize their understanding of society as political economy, historical materialism, dialectical materialism as philosophy, and so on. And they're looking at these macro or large societal processes rather than what sociology has often done, focusing upon the individual and individual behavior. But I kind of digress. But the discipline of political economy is more adequate to understanding the systemic crisis that we're involved in and the responses of the ruling elite to it. Now, when we say the ruling elite, we're literally talking about a very, very tiny group of men and women that have seized the commanding heights of the financial, industrial, and trading and monetary systems. They make most of the decisions. For example, when you hear the Federal Reserve has decided to keep interest rates low, well, who the hell is the Federal Reserve? And who do they represent? You'll get somebody, oh, that's our central bank. Okay, our central bank. But the question still is not answered. Who do they represent? It is the banker of bankers. It is the bank of the banks. It is the financial decision makers representing finance capital. And we have to come back to this idea of finance capital because there are a lot of, quote, new theories that obscure this very fact, and you can't understand very much of anything if you obscure the tiny core of people who run the system and who they represent and who they run the system for. Now, through all of this, and especially in these systemic crises, that is to say, the 1930s, 2008, and now 2021, the working class has suffered terribly. Now, add on to, and this again, putting a lot of things in a context. With the rise of Reaganism, and this is not just a Republican Party affair or a Ronald Reagan thing, a new set of policies were instituted, which can be defined pretty much by the word austerity. The working class was forced by the policies of the central government into austerity. The two things that define this period, the last 30, 35 years, austerity and war. Globalization, deindustrialization, the export of capital, the flatlining of wages and incomes of working people, a growing wealth and income gap between the elites. We could say the elites, the top 15%, but then the elite of the elite, the 1/10 of 1%, the 1/100th of 1%. A widening wealth and income gap and a continuing decline in the standard of living and the future of working people. This was going hand in hand with growing indebtedness. In other words, to maintain their standard of living, to educate their children, to pay their bills, working people had to go more and more into debt. The other thing is they were caught up, especially in 2008, in one of the worst bait and switch schemes in history. In other words, these bad mortgages that they sold to people. And you'd start out with, let's say, a 3% mortgage. And so a working family, Black, white, Latino, Asian, or whatever, would say, hey, man, the mortgage is 3%. We can buy a house in the suburbs. We can live the American dream. And it was a beautiful thing until 5 years later, built into that mortgage was that the mortgage went from 3% to 8%. And suddenly you're unable to pay the mortgage and you're kicked out of your house and you're back to where you started. You see what I'm saying? And but all of these schemes and all of these recessions and systemic crises affect working people terribly. And certainly the two last systemic crises, 2008 and the one we're in now, have left the working people poorer, more homeless, more hungry, and more uncertain about their future, and more alienated from the ruling class and the politicians that represent the ruling class. And so when you see and you hear or see in polling and other things, where working people don't trust or believe in anything. They're completely alienated, completely angered, and you can't find a true reflection of this on social media or in the corporate media. They've been completely silenced, most of the time being defined or smeared as terrorists and white supremacists. Let me just say a quick thing about economic theory, because this gets us to this Bidenomics. As I said before, political economy was the science of economics, but it was political economy because economics and the state were not seen as separate, but were seen as connected. Again, the greatest political economist was Marx. There's no two ways about that. But there were other important thinkers in the Marxist tradition. I like to just mention late 19th century theorist, a man by the name of Rudolf Hilferding, who wrote a very, very important book called Finance Capital. And what he saw is that capitalism had been seized or taken over by the big banks and financial institutions. And as we went forward, rather than an industrial policy, and we see this in the United States, no industrial policy, but always a policy to save the banks, a financial policy. The other is Lenin and his concept of imperialism. And he argued that imperialism is not policy, although it has policies, but imperialism is a system. It is a stage in the development of capitalism, defined by the fact that the state merges with the banks and the large corporations, producing what Lenin called state monopoly capitalism. And he made bold predictions that this is the final stage of capitalism. It is capitalism in a general crisis. You will also see that he calls it state monopoly capitalism, which goes back to the original intent of political economy, that is, the state and the economy. The greatest bourgeois political economist of the recent era is John Maynard Keynes. And John Maynard Keynes is important because he changes the paradigm from what was called free market or laissez-faire capitalism to a recognition that capitalism cannot save itself from its own internal contradictions unless the state gets involved in regulating the economy. Keynes's most important book, and it is an important book, is entitled A General Theory, and these three categories are very important, of employment, interest, and money. And in a lot of ways, to understand those three things helps us to understand features and aspects of the current crisis. For example, interest rates are low, so making it possible for the banks to borrow at the cheapest rate possible, and for the big corporations to borrow at the cheapest rates possible, almost zero. But inflation is happening while interest rates are low. How to explain that? I don't know. I don't know that the quote economists and experts know. But it was assumed that if you had low interest rates, you would tend not to have inflation. But we have low interest rates for the as they say, the largest borrowers, who are the banks and the big corporations, near zero, while inflation is going off the hook. But Keynesian economics, as a paradigm, as a guide to policy for the state, for the capitalist class, was overthrown in the early 80s by the theories and thinking of a man by the name of Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman's economic theories and policies were tied to a concept known as supply side economics, or neoclassical economics. Milton Friedman said, get the government, get the state out of the economy. Let the economy and the market resolve its own contradictions, which it can do without the state. Friedman and Friedmanites in supply side economics say that the state and its intervention produces inflation and distortion of the economy, of labor markets, of markets for other goods. For example, Bill Clinton is known, his administration is known not only for the crime bill that ended up locking about 25% of young Black men in prison, but also for the welfare reform bill, which in effect punished people on welfare. But the idea comes from supply side economics. Let them eat cake, let them starve, and they will be forced to work for whatever the employers are prepared to offer them. Supply side economics is also committed to destroying the trade union movement, saying that this artificially sets the wage for workers. And they say all economic decisions and all economic processes should be determined by the capitalist marketplace. And if you let the market work its way through these issues, it will on its own arrive at something called equilibrium. And individuals, the aggregate of individuals, the population, the workforce, and so on, will decide for itself as individuals what is good and what is not good. They associate this with freedom, with liberty. In other words, the capitalists have the freedom to become multi-billionaires and to exploit you, and you have the freedom to starve. It's like you decided by the choices that you made to starve or prosper. But that's what they believe. I mean, really. But then there was another school, that had recently emerged, and this is very important also, because it approaches market economics not from the standpoint of each individual making a rational choice. So the poor have the capacity to rationally decide, just like the super rich. I am, me, I am equally free and equally empowered as an agent of my own fate as Oprah Winfrey is, or as Mark Zuckerberg is. We're all equal. We're equally free and, so on. But that's a theory rooted in what we call rational choice. And there's a long history to that going back to John Locke. It is very Anglo-Saxon. It is very reductionist. Everything is reduced to the individual. Remember, we said that Marxists, be they Marx or after Marx, were looking at large class movements. Free market economics looks not at that, it looks at the individual. I want to come back to that because there's a lot in common between the assumptions of free market economic theories and identity politics. It's quite ironic, you know what I'm saying? And of course, the new theories of race, but we'll come back to that. But then another school arose, but it's not as huge or as important in the large scheme of things as Friedmanite economics or Keynesian economics, and it is called behavioral economics. And literally, economic theory becomes a branch of psychology. Isn't that interesting? In the sense of the behavioral economists say, well, people are not deciding things rationally, but they're driven by wants, desires, the unconscious mind, like Freud would argue, and psychological needs. Now, of course, this is very important in marketing and branding commodities. For example, I have argued that modern day culture is an invention of a ruling elite committed to creating desires and needs, psychological needs, and imagined needs on the part of the population. So pop culture and marketing are one and the same, or go together, I'll put it that way. Because pop culture creates desire, desire for things, desire for wants. So we got in the early rise of hip hop, and okay, I'll say to my friends, I'm not talking about conscious hip hop, whatever that is, but yeah, that's a deep question, conscious. But anyway, this imaging of the thug and the rapper as rich with gold chains and all of the things that represent success using a capitalist value system, where things matter more than people. We're accumulating things ostentatiously is more important than human values. One is struck in the evolution of Black popular culture, how we go from What's Going On by Marvin Gaye as this great popular outpouring of feeling and consciousness, And then you go, let us say, to Snoop Dogg or Jay-Z or others, okay? Now, and then of course the rise of the video and so on, video imaging and music videos promoted this. But this feeds into what we call behavioral economics. You know, if you're from back in the day and you go from Marvin Gaye, Curtis Mayfield, Aretha Franklin, pop music, and then you come up to gangster rap, you say, God, where did this come from? And who does it serve? And I'm arguing that from the standpoint of marketing and behavioral economics, pop culture strengthens or helps to develop the market for useless and unnecessary things. And, again, to connect things to now and to economic theory, what there is an uncomfortable for many connection between bourgeois economic theory, in this case behavioral economics, and identity politics. Each kind of plays into or arises theoretically out of certain assumptions about what is important and who is important. Classical political economy, let us say Marx, class is important. Identity politics, the individual is important. I'm outraged, I'm angry, I don't feel a certain way, I feel this way. And thus, to channel all of that, you can call it angst, you can call it desire, towards the market. You get it? Just look at it. All of this Black Lives Matter channeled towards a market. The woke trope, the woke individual is not only woke because she or he is, quote, conscious, but has a woke lifestyle. Self-care, which feeds into, vegetarianism, and I'm not against vegetarians if that's what you do, feeds into a whole lifestyle, and hence a lifestyle change that connects to a rebranding of a cultural rebranding of capitalism and a capitalist reset. Okay, so let me just, while all of this is going on, all of this imaging, all of this branding, all of this representation, all of this diversity, because the bourgeoisie or the upper middle class, the college degreed individuals, and not all of them, of course, have money to spend to buy things. So you create at the youngest age in these people a desire for things, a desire to be woke, a desire to have woke things, a desire to live in a woke, or what we would traditionally call a gentrified neighborhood. See, it's very, okay, let me just, I wish I were a comedian, and so I could make the joke out of this that it needs to be. But but here we are in a systemic crisis. And everybody's woke. And the capitalists are woke. And they might be among the most woke people. But we're in a systemic crisis. Working people are unemployed. Working people have lost their homes. Working people are hungry. Working people are on the streets. Working people are killing themselves through direct suicide and through addictions. Well, the assumption is they're in all these problems because they're not woke. If they were woke, they would be living like I'm living. They made bad decisions. Okay, we're back to neoclassic economics, right? the rational choice, or their desires do not fit in to a lifestyle that would lead them to live a better life, a more productive life, a more comfortable life. So again, the assumption is, and it is, an assumption of bourgeois, neoclassical, and even supply-side free market economics, that if the working class who are suffering, who are unemployed, who are hungry, who are under bridges shooting dope, if they were woke, like Joe Dorsey, founder of Twitter, Mark Zuckerberg, Oprah Winfrey, Barack Obama. These are woke. These are icons of wokeness. If the poor were woke, they would do better. You see, they wouldn't shoot dope. You know, they would be into self-care. But as you can see, the ideological and theoretical assumptions are not that different between market economics. By market economics, we mean expanding the market for things you don't need, creating a cultural framework that also creates desire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what the woke people do not see or refuse to see, well, I'm talking about the general mass of so-called woke people. I'm not talking about that elite, that tiny elite that control the levers of power economically, financially, politically. But what woke theory functions to do is to obscure the nature of the crisis, to obscure the source of the crisis, to obscure the class nature of the crisis. Okay? And more than anything, to obscure the way out of the crisis. Even when they identify themselves as socialists, they really don't want a socialist economy. They want a woke economy. Okay, we'll come back to that. I would just like to read to you, because they have recently, you hear people refer to Joe Biden. Now remember, Joe Biden is one of the most conservative of Democrats. He was a Republican in Democratic, as defined as a Democrat. You know, it's what you call a wolf in sheep's clothing. You know, he stood up for the worst of neoliberal economics, deindustrialization. In fact, he's from a state where there's little industry, so he didn't have any constraints. But now he's being called a woke president and the representative, a president who is more like Franklin Delano Roosevelt than Ronald Reagan. But here is what Martin Wolf said. I want to quote this. I hope everybody listens to this. Martin Wolf is a very important journalist and thinker, and he writes in the Financial Times. Listen to how he puts it. Biden is playing for huge stakes, and he knows it. This is not just about securing a strong post-COVID economic recovery for the US. It's not just about restoring the US position in the world as ally and as actor on crucial issues such as climate. It is not just about proving that the US government is capable of doing important things. It is now about protecting the core of democracy. Protecting the core of democracy. to be read, Protecting the Rule of the Ruling Elite. That is what is at stake. They all understand what we in the free school have understood for some time, that we're in a struggle of ideas, an ideological struggle. Which way forward? The nation politically is in a political standoff, what many commentators have called a cold civil war. A civil war which has not yet gotten hot. But this civil war is also a class divide. Doesn't have a pure reflection. It's not like barricades, the working class on one side and the capitalists and the police on the other side. It's a little more fluid. But what is being called the cold civil war is a manifestation of an intensifying and growing class division in the country. It is this fact that Martin Wolf, that those people who are shaping the policies of the Biden administration understand. And so, in the throes of this intensifying ideological struggle, and I was talking to Yvonne about this on the phone the other day, and sometimes we despair because of just the comprehensiveness of the ideological and psychological attack upon the people. And how will the people see their way through this? Our emphasis, of course, is the people, the working people, the poor, of every race, of every religion, of every ethnicity. That's our emphasis. It's not some woke crowd, you know? How will the people, in a situation where leadership has not emerged, how will they see through this? But the ruling class and the academics and the celebrity intellectuals and their books and their ideas have thrown at the people such ideas as woke capitalism, the great capitalist reset, and a cultural rebranding of capitalism, which is making it more democratic, by which they mean, interestingly, more bourgeois voices being heard. That is why LGBTQ is so important. Not because they're interested in LGBTQs who are working people, who are poor people, who are, struggling people, who are parents. They're not concerned with them, but they're concerned that in all of this talk that the bourgeoisie indulges in, and it is talk. Oh God, I mean, that's what gets you down most of the time. All of the talk, they can talk day and night. You know what I'm saying? They mean a diversity of people talking. So if you look at cable news, we not only have all white men, we have women of color, and they're expressing themselves, and we have LGBTQ, transgender. We're all in the conversation, or so it would appear. That is the cultural rebranding of capitalism. It looks different, although it is not different. It looks democratic, although it is the opposite of democracy. It appears to be one thing, but in essence, it is something very different. And to know the difference between the appearance and the essence It's a matter of what side of the class divide you're on. If you're on the bourgeois side, oh, it looks beautiful. Oh, look, trans people are fighting back. Oh, there's a black person, oh, a black woman, and she's expressing herself. You know, but they don't tell you that black woman graduated from Harvard. Both of her parents were college professors. She ain't representing the working class black people. Oh, but she's black and she knows the feelings of all black people. But no, you don't. You get where I'm coming from? So it's a game. But then we have, for the radical side of the conversation, because we're diverse, we're including all voices now, so we must include the radical voices, and I put quotes around radical. For them, we have the theory of racial capitalism, a so-called new race theory. However, a new race theory and theory of capitalism that is divorced from class. So in its substance, it is an out and out attack upon the foundations of Marxist political economy and the Marxian theory of capitalism. Now, everybody is free to critique, reject, accept previous theories as they so choose, and it's all good. But please do me a favor, just say what you're doing. But in this instance, they can't say what they're doing because it is not a theory, it is a slogan. So it is a way of doing identity politics and, quote, new race theory politics by acknowledging that the system is capitalist. When you get right down to it, it's a joke too. But at the end of the day, racial capitalism as a theory, as a trope, as a slogan, is more of a cultural theory than a political economy theory. You see? When has capitalism not been racial? You didn't discover that. If you want to study it, we can go to Black Reconstruction, which may be asking too much of people who are satisfied with slogans. But racial capitalism obscures the essence of the capitalist systemic crisis of this time, and therefore can only talk without a way out. Racial capitalists will more than not align with Biden and the, quote, liberal wing of the Democratic Party and attack large parts of the working class, etc. They will claim to be standing up for Black people. And it's just like Barack Obama standing up for Black people. If he's in my corner, I want to get out of my corner. A Trojan horse, a fraud. And so with this theory. Then the theory of settler colonialism, which is connected to the New York Times 1619 Project. When the New York Times advances a theory of capitalism and race, I basically don't want any parts of it because I know what the interest ideologically and politically of the New York Times is. It is a class-conscious organ of the dominant elements of finance capital. That's all it is. It's not an organ of truth. It is not an organ of racial reckoning. It is, and in fact, it represents the most predatory, exploiting elements and war elements of the ruling class. So the 1619 Project, which is connected to the idea of the counter-revolution of 1776, is also linked to the settler colonial theory. Again, sounds radical, sounds very black, sounds very woke, and it has to sound woke even if it isn't. And it allows for a wide range of talking points. Again, in all of this, it's more about talk than about fundamental theory and understanding of a systemic crisis. So you say to the settler colonialist, can you explain inflation? Can you explain the uncertainty of the ruling class in a time of inflation? Well, what about finance capital? Well, I ain't concerned about that. You know, it's a part, I mean, it feeds in, I see that similarity between Isabel Wilkerson's theory of caste. All white people are Brahmins, or the upper caste. All black people are Dalits, the underclass, or the untouchables. And Asians and Hispanics are in the class striving to get into the Brahmins. Well, that theory, if you think about its geography, its structure, fits well with settler colonialism. All white people, the poor white as well as the financiers and the high-tech capitalists, benefit from capitalism and racial capitalism. It is a system without class contradiction. The only contradiction they are prepared to acknowledge is a racial contradiction, but a racial contradiction separated from the class contradictions of the society. Finally, I just want to talk about a great tragedy in the mix of all of this, and that is the decline of BAR, Black Agenda Report, and our having lost it. And when I say our, the people having lost BAR as a voice of the genuine Black left and of the people striving to be free. Most of us have watched with dismay over the last year or so the rebranding of BAR, it becoming something that is unrecognizable. And we had to conclude that ideologically, the Black Agenda Report today is closer to the AOC Bernie Sanders BLM wing of the Democratic Party than it is to the working class, and certainly to the Black radical tradition. They have savaged Du Bois, made him look like a complete fool, a man without intellectual or moral or ideological foundations. They have abandoned any discussion or concern with the Black working class, and when they do mention it, everyone knows it's not really serious. Today, it is a weak and unrecognizable version of its former self. And probably the final nail in the coffin of BAR was seen in last week's edition, where Barr published a reprint from the Atlantic magazine of an article by Ibram Kendi. Before we even get to Ibram Kendi, who is well known to all of us, let's talk about the Atlantic magazine, which when Du Bois published his article, The African Roots of the War, in it in 1915, was a relatively progressive magazine. After World War II, and certainly into the 60s, it became a journal committed to Israel first and foremost, and to the destruction and war on the Palestinians. It increasingly became committed to war and became a platform for the neocons, neoconservatives, who were proposing wars throughout the Middle East, of course, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. Of course, it had the appropriate window dressing of a Black, of a woman, of this, of that, you know, the symbols of diversity. In that sense, they are woke. It's no question, however, and we saw this play out in the 2020 election, where retired generals, not just one, but constantly retired generals being given the platform of the Atlantic to rail against Trump and his proposals to withdraw 35,000 US troops from NATO in Germany and to withdraw completely all US troops from Afghanistan. The Atlantic became a platform for all of the claims that Russia and Putin had influenced the 2016 election, and the Russians were putting bounties on the heads of US soldiers in Afghanistan, and all of these lies. The Atlantic is among some of the strongest voices calling for the containment of China. That is the Atlantic. So the very fact that the reprint is from the Atlantic itself raises terribly serious political questions. For example, what side are you really on? The second thing is Ibram Kendi. I don't know of very many serious, radical intellectuals that have not figured Kendi out. That he is an invention of the ruling class, that he is a mouthpiece of that class, that his ideas of race and how to become an anti-racist is more about how to become a famous Black person operating within the framework and with the permission of the ruling class, who itself upholds institutions of racism. Kendi is not interested in radical change that would liberate the masses of oppressed Black and working class people. That is Ibram Kendi. I had published an article last year critiquing Kendi. I was told that it was, if not the most, one of the most read articles in the Black Agenda report. People are interested. And I wrote the article particularly for Black Agenda report, and wrote it in a way that I felt would inform the readers of Black Agenda report. But then to publish an article which basically says nothing. It's interesting, I saw an interview or conversation with Norman Finkelstein, and somebody said, well, you know, are you aware that Kendi has wrote an anti-racist children's book? And Finkelstein replied, he said, all of his books are children's books. uh, to which I would agree. But here you have a woke movement who would substitute Kendi for Du Bois or Kendi for Baldwin or Kendi for Angela Davis or Kendi for Zora Neale Hurston, even Toni Morrison. That if you want to know about race and how to be an anti-racist, go to Kendi. Not to Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk, not Double Consciousness, not The Veil, none of this. Because as quiet as it's kept, Kendi is anti-Du Bois. Because you can't ride two horses going in opposite. You can't be with Afrocentrism and Molefe Asante and W.E.B. Du Bois. They don't fit. But I say all of that to also express the fact that I'm grieving over the loss of Black Agenda Report, off of the side of the fact that its great genius, and Glenn Ford is a genius, has been sidelined and basically silenced. Last week, Glenn and I spoke, and Glenn is ill. And, you know, he said, you know, and we're like that, you know. And he asked me after, he said, you know, let's do an interview, Tony. And I never have said no to Glenn. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, call me on Monday. But I had seen this article. And when I talked to Glenn, I said to Glenn, he said, oh, yeah, man, let me get the equipment up so we can do the interview. And I said, no, Glenn, I can't do the interview. And I said, I never imagined that I would ever say no to you. But I said, I cannot associate my name with the Black Agenda Report any longer. And I've been with Black Agenda Report from its beginning. When I say being with it, I'm a supporter of it, writer in it, reader of it. But I cannot associate myself on principle with this. This is a betrayal. What it is today is a betrayal of the Black masses and of the Black working class. It is a political scheme to align itself with the capitalist class, to become successful by betrayal and opportunism. So I say this to end this discussion of economics and political economy, to only say that a path to the resolution of the crisis that the country and the nation and the working class and people now face will be also in a principled approach to ideas in the ideological struggle. Thanks a lot, Joe.
Thanks so much. This is actually so important. I think that, I mean, this is why I'm proud to be part of this free school, because of presentations like this, which is so clarifying, and really going back to what it really means to be the left. What the left is, ever since the modern left developed, whether you're talking about Marxism, whether you're talking about the anti-colonial struggle, whether you're talking about the civil rights movement, it's about the struggle for principled ideas, but also understanding political economy and struggling within the framework of political economy. for the ending of poverty and taking away power from the ruling elite. And as you said, all these modern so-called radical theories are all meant to obscure. And I mean, I was laughing when you were saying, like, ask someone from who's dealing with settler colonial thesis or racial capitalism, ask them to explain inflation. I was laughing because it's so true. I mean, it's such a dumbing down of politics that literally they have no idea. I mean, I'm not saying that you have to have a PhD in economics. Actually, if you have a PhD in economics, you're less likely to understand it, I should say. But I'm not saying you have to understand all the equations and everything, but there's just a total dumbing down where it's not even in the conversation, any of these questions. And also, I mean, there's so much to talk about. I just wanted to say that this issue of rebranding, I think so much of what we're living through is a rebranding. It is very marketing oriented, very, you could say, behavioral economics oriented. Rebrand everything, like you said. Biden is rebranded as the woke Roosevelt. You know, a lot of people are being, and then all these ideas on the left, it's all rebranding to basically destroy it and present it to you. So rebranding of socialism. AOC is socialism. Bernie Sanders is socialism. You can be a socialist and support Joe Biden. Rebranding, as you were saying, rebranding race and anti-racism. Rebranding even civil rights. You can invoke King's name and support Biden. It's totally a rebranding to attack anything to do with political economy as the foundation of a principled left. And just to briefly say about Black Agenda Report, I mean, I'm also quite sad about what's happened. Some people know that I've, in a personal capacity, have been associated with Black Agenda Report, in addition to the fact that Free School had a relationship with Black Agenda Report. And for a long time, I had, even before I had joined, I mean, I had read that website. I was always very impressed by it. It really was one of the only courageous platforms out there, especially in the years of Barack Obama. It was pretty much the only major Black website, Black kind of news organization that was being very principled in attacking Obama and taking unpopular stances and standing up for the Black radical tradition. But very sad to say that what's developed now recently, in some ways, is they've tried to rebrand themselves and make themselves acceptable in this new era of Black Lives Matter and AOC and the woke Democrats. And while it may make them more popular among those circles, it is totally abandoning the original reason that people like us were interested in what Bar was doing. So sadly, I can no longer recommend it to people as a platform for political education or news. And I mean, it's very sad because we're almost reduced to nothing. There's very little platforms available, but besides Free School and a couple of other people out there still struggling in this era for ideological clarity. So then there's a lot of things we could talk about, but let's hear from the others.
Jahan, I just, briefly on the Black Agenda Report topic, I just want to echo what both you and Doc said. I mean, I actually first started reading Black Agenda Report when I was in high school. And, this is over 10 years ago. And when I was sort of first engaging with certain different political ideas. And, I would go as far as to say that it was a sort of lifeline during those Obama years, especially just coming up as a young person at that time with all of these wars and, all of this confusion surrounding the rise of identity politics and all these things. And the fact that, Barr was able to, as you said, Jahan, deliver this highly principled and detailed criticism of Obama's policies and everything he stood for, not just rhetoric about, you know, on a surface level, but real criticism. And I think also even some of their writings during the first wave of BLM protests were just so clarifying and were something that I felt like I could recommend to other people. And, especially when you feel isolated, being in places where there isn't a connection to, you know, an organic Black community, or let alone the Black left. I think Black Agenda Report was just so pivotal for bringing people into a different world of politics, in a different way of ideologically approaching issues. So I just, before we go back to the rest of this very rich presentation on political economy, I just wanted to say that, because I think it is tragic in many ways, just from my personal experience of having been an avid reader from a fairly young age of this publication, to not really be able to recommend it as having continuity with the publication that I originally started reading.
Yeah, I think Doc, thank you for that presentation. It was super clarifying on so many different levels. And I think like when you talk about like the nature of the ideological struggle, I think one of the primary, it seems, ways in which like you have to wage the ideological struggle is to, I think in these times, to be able to actually accurately identify who the enemy is and who you're struggling against. And I think what is so sad about what you're describing with Black Agenda Report is that it's very clear that Ibram X. Kendi is the voice of the ruling class. And if the whole point of BAR is to be a voice of opposition and to actually analyze the workings of the ruling class, then it is a contradiction that you're now bringing in someone who represents who you are supposedly against, like the enemy. Because I think that goes beyond the sort of, it goes beyond the sort of thing where it's like, oh, you're a media platform, you're trying to encourage at least some kind of like diversity of viewpoints, even like some kind of like debate, discussion. And I think it crosses into that territory of, yeah, are you going to be a voice that is against the ruling class and trying to analyze it and trying to analyze the crisis, or are you going to become another mouthpiece for the ruling elite through people like Kendi? And so I think that's part of, yeah, what makes it so sad, that there is the continuingly, I feel like the sort of decline of that clarity, which BAR represented and upheld, it seems like for especially the Obama years, and before that. And yeah, and then I think the other point was how you talked about how identity politics fit into this framework of like free market ideology, and how it's all focused on the individual and like the individual's like actions. Because yeah, it's I think it's easy to like as a younger person to sort of look at things and be like, oh, this is like all like new stuff, you know? But really it's just a rebranding of older ideology in a more sinister way. And I think that aspect of it, like if you don't have that grounding and these sort of fundamentals of what you're talking about in terms of political economy, if you don't have a grounding in that, you have no way of gauging what's right, what's wrong, like where is the struggle, like what are the actual contradictions, that kind of thing. And yeah, I guess one of the questions I had, I guess, was if sort of like that free market supply side economics is kind of based in austerity, I guess how does that kind of coalesce or work with, I guess, like the whole like really huge government spending, which I feel like is not necessarily, that's like not, that doesn't really count as austerity, right? I guess that was just sort of one of my basic questions in relation to that, but yeah.
Can I just, I mean, I think this is very important. In fact, Jeremiah, I was just thinking, we're back to a question you asked about a year ago about valuation theory. We really haven't got, but I'm so interested in pursuing that. But how has there been an overturning of the neoliberal free market or supply side economics. Is Biden representing that? Well, another way to ask, if he does represent that, why? I think Martin Wolf in the Financial Times begins to say the stakes are very high. We're in a systemic crisis. That's why I tried to make a difference between the 9 recessions between 1945 and 2004, 5, something like that. And the 2008, quote, Great Recession and what we're living through now. These, like the Great Depression, has hit at the system itself. The system functions through normal recessions, ups and downs. But then there are crises that bring forward deep-seated contradictions in the system. And Martin Wolf, who is a well-schooled and very smart social democrat, he knows his Marxism. He knows when he says the stakes are high, he knows that we in the United States are in a cold civil war, a political standoff. Nothing has changed since November 2020 politically, or you want to say January 6, 2021. The standoff continues, the cold civil war. Cold civil war, meaning a civil war situation that has not yet gotten hot. And by hot, we don't necessarily mean weapons, although that could be involved, you never know. But we mean where the masses of alienated people move to take state power in one form or another. That's when it gets hot. Now, so Martin Wolf says that these are the stakes, whether or not, and he uses, they speak through code language. The question is democracy, which is what he's saying is the rule of the ruling class. The rule of the ruling class is at stake. And so the question that we have been talking, I don't know, we've said it so much, I don't know. You get exhausted saying the same thing. Crisis of legitimacy. Can the ruling class rule in the old way? What Biden is acknowledging, no, we can't. Now, this is the hard thing. A system which for 35 years, governmentally and economically and institutionally, shaped itself around the assumptions and policies of neoliberal economics and neoliberal globalization. Does it have the mechanisms to transform itself to meet this crisis? Another big thing, a system which over the last 70 years has accumulated more debt on more debt on more debt through a lot of things, of rich not paying taxes, wars, and all of this. What does it mean to go into more debt? Now, Biden is saying, well, we're going to tax the rich and the corporations. Let's be real. You can have a tax on the books, but how you collect it. You know what I'm saying? So even to pay for the $6 trillion that he's proposing means further sovereign debt, while inflation is going up and the value of the dollar is in decline internationally. This is a crisis of unprecedented dimensions. Can they go, and that's what they, in terms of the working class, policies of austerity to policies of providing for the working people. And they say they want to do a lot of things, child care, etc. Free junior college, forgiving debt, college debt, and so on. It all sounds good. My point is this. John Maynard Keynes, in his general theory, said there's a way out of the systemic crisis of capitalism of that time, of the 1930s. The question mark, is there a way out of the systemic crisis of this time? Or is it, in the case of Biden, even with all these trillions, too little, too late? And we don't know, Jared. We just don't know. They don't know. But this is what must be put on the table. This is where the discussion must be. And that's why all of this other, woke this and this, that, and the is, it's just irrelevant and obscurantist. I'm sorry to take so long to answer the question, Jerry. I'm sorry.
Yeah, on this issue also of behavioral economics and
Yes.
identity politics, well, something we talked about a couple weeks ago. This other theory, modern monetary theory.
Oh boy.
Which is the cutting edge, maybe, of economic theory, but which is being used mostly from according to what I've read, to justify the Biden administration's record spending.
Yeah.
And basically, to recap what it is very briefly, is just that the argument that the government can keep printing money and spending money without consequences. So what I found interesting about it is that it's basically making the argument that you could spend $6 trillion on infrastructure. You can meet all the so-called human infrastructure needs without cutting back anywhere else, which means if you cut through what it really means, it means without cutting the defense budget, without cutting the war economy, without cutting the 800 military base, because you're adding $6 trillion in infrastructure, but overall, almost over $1 trillion is being spent every year just in war. And that's just officially what's being spent, not including the secondary costs, tertiary costs. So, I mean, that's a big part. They're trying to have both, They're trying, like they used to say in the Cold War that they were going to force the Soviet Union to choose between guns or butter. They're trying to have guns and butter, but you can't really have it like that in 2021 with the way the world is emerging. And on this issue of democracy, it's quite interesting, as Doc was saying, that Martin Wolf is talking about Biden's goal is to save democracy, show democracy is the best model. I want to direct everyone's attention to an event which happened this past week in Copenhagen called the Copenhagen Summit for Democracy, organized by an NGO called the Alliance for Democracies, an NGO which is openly official. The head of it is the former head of NATO, and Joe Biden has been affiliated with it since it was founded in 2018. And this organization is holding 2 summits this year. The first summit, which was this past week, is meant to bring activists and kind of heads of smaller states from around the world to promote democracy. And the second conference, whose date has not been announced, but is going to be at the end of the year, is going to be hosted by Joe Biden, and is going to be all the major heads of state who are part of his alliance of democracies. But what's interesting about the Summit for Democracies, which happened, is that they're taking this question very seriously. They're very worried that people around the world are losing faith in democracy, which again is code for the Western model of government and economics. So they commissioned a poll themselves on what is the greatest threat to democracy, what is the world public opinion, I should say, perceive as the greatest threat to democracy. So they asked people around the world, which state, which government, which country is the greatest threat to democracy? They were hoping that people would say Russia or China, but no. The number one threat people around the world chose was the United States as the world's greatest threat to democracy. Then they asked, which factor is the greatest threat to democracy? People around the world said rising inequality and the power of the super rich is the greatest threat to democracy. So this conference is being organized with that knowledge. And the other major objective of this conference is to battle quote unquote global disinformation. Actually, this NGO, when it was started, in 2018, one of the major things it was about was also pushing this Russian disinformation narrative. And they helped to create this so-called global committee against disinformation. So all of that has happened in Copenhagen. And, you know, they had the attendees included this former head of NATO who's an organizer, the various presidents and prime ministers from the Western friendly countries in Eastern Europe, the president of Taiwan, these activists from Hong Kong, this so-called president of Venezuela, Guaido, who nobody recognizes except the United States, and along with, of course, executives from Twitter and other social media companies. So yeah, definitely this global rebranding of democracy, along with this push to supposedly battle inequality by trying to create some kind of new economic model, perhaps justified by modern monetary theory, making the argument that you can have both. You can have guns and butter. You can have human infrastructure. You can have end college debt. You can have good paying green energy jobs. But at the same time, you can not only keep 800 military bases, you can expand them. You can spend hundreds of billions of dollars on new nuclear missiles. You can keep giving billions of dollars in aid to Israel as they crack down and murder Palestinians. You can keep doing all that stuff, is what they're claiming. Whether that will work in reality, that remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If I could just add to that, Jahan, first I just want to thank Doc for an incredible presentation. Sometimes you bring such clarity in a moment where it's desperately needed. And so I sincerely appreciated the presentation. And I have a lot I want to say, but I'll keep it brief to come back to some of these points. But I want to highlight the fact that you said woke people and woke theory functions to obscure the nature of the crisis. I mean, that is so profound, because you said it obscures the class nature of the crisis, and you said it obscures the way out of the crisis. And then you talked about this very idea that woke capitalism, this cultural rebranding of capitalism, is exactly how this has always functioned. And I think this is Jeremiah's point when he's talking about identifying the enemy. Marx was also saying we have to identify the problem correctly. Right. He says if this global economic system, what you're raving about, is supposed to produce liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy, Marx said it's failing to produce all those very things you're claiming that it's supposed to produce. It's failing to produce liberty. It's failing to produce equality. It's failing to produce fraternity, and it's surely failing to produce democracy. And so when Marx is identifying those problems, this is exactly what I think you were highlighting, his cultural rebranding, because Marx is looking at the structures and the social effects that this system produces. And he's saying, well, if you look at the nature of a capitalist system, and we'll come back to that as capitalism comes into the world, racialized, wrapped in racism, racial capitalism. When has it not been racialized, you know? But this is Marx's point too, because he's saying, well, capitalism was, I mean, it's slavery by another name. Mm-hmm. It was literally a development by refinement from feudalism, just like feudalism was the development by refinement from slavery. So yes, let's just look at the dominant relationships in the system. Slavery, master slave. Okay, superior, inferior. Feudalism, lord serf, still the same relationship. Capitalism, employer employee. Oh, nicer terminology, but the relation is fundamentally the same. You're still going to have the same structure. This was your point here. This tiny group of people at the top, major shareholders, top executives, who are making all of the key decisions regarding everything. What to produce, how to produce, when to produce, and surely what to do with the profits. And this is in some ways, when you're looking at the nature of this system, you're looking at a system where you had $1.2 trillion where the billionaire class has gotten richer during a pandemic. You see what I'm saying? You know, it's unprecedented to see that level of inequality during a global, you know, billionaire wealth standing at $4.6 trillion. That's up 35% from January 2020. So, I mean, this is quite remarkable to think about. I can't get past this point because And I want to come back to this Biden FDR, you know, this whole comparison between Biden and FDR. Now, first off, FDR did a few things, but don't get it. It's not like he's just some savior for the world, you know. But Biden has no. I mean, FDR, he was also a centrist Democrat when he ran for office. You know, he was focused on balancing the budget, and so yes, he established a social security system. Yes, he established federal unemployment compensation programs. Yes, he, you know, for people who didn't have jobs, they could get a check each week, right? Yes, he had a minimum wage that was passed, right? So but he also initiated a public jobs program for millions and millions of people. Biden is nowhere close to implementing a public jobs program for millions and millions of people. He is, maybe he will, I doubt it, but you know, in that sense, or taxes. How are you gonna pay for all these programs, Biden? The corporate profits tax rate you're talking about, it's at 21%. You were thinking about going to 28%. It was at 35% when Trump was in office before he dropped it down to 21%, right? So you had 40 years of distributed income from the bottom to the top. Republicans are not going to go for this hike from 21 to 28%. So you're already talking about a compromise, as Jahan was talking about now, between 24 and 25%. And the same is true for the personal income tax. Oh, he's going to raise it from 37% to 39%, a very modest increase. Well, when FDR had proposed it, I think it was one of his State of the Union addresses, he proposed 100% tax on the richest Americans after they made, say, $400,000. It was 100% tax. Biden's nowhere close to that. Now, of course, the Republicans raised hell and they dropped down to 94%. But Biden's nowhere close to those types of marks. So to compare him to FDR, that is also that cultural rebranding. You know, a 40 some odd years, like you said, being really a Republican, being the architect of exploitation, being the architect of locking brothers and sisters up, super predators, being the architect of mass incarceration. Oh, but we're going to rebrand Biden now as an FDR-like president, and he's nowhere even close to some of the very basic things FDR was doing back then that would warrant the comparison. But this great capitalist reset, this cultural, I can't get past obscuring the very nature of the system. You haven't even began to change the fundamental relationship in the system. You're not going to change its structure. I mean, you're just going to reform capitalism, reset capitalism. These systems love reform. Reform is that obscurantism. It's self-preservation. You see, it might buy them a little time, but perhaps exploitations. I mean, that's the whole point of capitalism. I can't remember which conference it was you had at Temple. I don't know if it was you or Lewis Gordon. It was a conversation on Du Bois and Black Reconstruction. And one of you suggested that the fantasy of capitalism is to produce profits without people. And you were talking about automation and computerization. And so this reset had that same potential where these, all these, who are you going to hire to do all of these things? Well, what are they going to do with the profits? Are they going to hire machines or workers? But I can't get past what you said about the obscurantism, how on point that is, that cultural rebranding, because that's how capitalism operates in a moment of deep crisis. Let us reform it. That's why Nkrumah called it the gentleman's method of slavery. It's the same fundamental relationship. You're still exploitation, still driving the system. So I think in some ways, the way in which you frame that, especially leadership not emerging whatsoever, celebrity intellectuals, diversity of people just talking on television, no substance, no serious, no serious substantive change being taught. Oh, we're gonna put some people, these talking heads on CNN. I almost broke my TV watching CNN. I said, I can't watch this shit no more. I'm yelling at the TV. Somebody walking by my apartment probably think I'm crazy because I'm yelling at the TV. What the hell are they talking about it? But this racial capitalism thing, that's also a hell of a thing that we have to begin to understand as capitalism comes into the world racialized. The foundation is the slave trade. It has European characteristics. It has European values. It's the ways in which Europeans dealt with difference. It comes into wrapped in racism. It functioned to exploit Black labor. This is why without race, you can't really understand the trajectory of the capitalism, that system of social production, which is where Du Bois adds to Marxist analysis, I think, the class structure of production. And that I've never even heard that talked about on television yet. Nobody's talking about the class structure of production, the internal organization of enterprises, mass of workers. Nobody's talking about the wage. So I just wanted to add that point because the obscurantism is so important to obscure the nature of the crisis and the solution to the crisis. That is so deep and so powerful the way you said. So I wanted to thank you for the clarity, but also just an incredible presentation going through the economic theories and seeing the vacillation between private capitalism, state capitalism, depending on which theorist it is, and just the last 75 years of vacillating between the two. More government intervention, less government intervention, and then trying to rebrand the government intervention now in such a way that still resets capitalism to maintain itself, to survive, to preserve itself, and to really just prolong the human suffering.
Yeah, the other part of, along with what you were saying, Brandon, that specific point that Doc made, that woke people and woke theory, what it does is obscures the nature of the crisis, the class nature of the crisis, and also the way out. The other part of that was when Doc was talking about like, how do you, like, being able to distinguish between democracy as in, like, is democracy having more inclusive voices on your television versus like actual democracy is, it all depends on what side of the class divide you're on. Like that very basic definition that's lost today. And I think this whole Doc presentation, it really reminded me also of the importance of something the free school does, which is even give definitions for these terms of what is democracy. Or even, for example, what is violence? Like today in woke society, like language is violence to people. Not using someone's pronouns is violence. But what about the war on workers? What about the war around the world? What about the violence of gentrification, the violence of unemployment, like you said, where the statistics don't even encapsulate how many people are actually unemployed? And it also reminded me of, because I think a huge part of us reading Russian America was being able to go through those definitions again, that democracy is, the opposite of democracy is poverty. And, or even, for example, the definition of war. War, the cause of war is the degradation of the worker worldwide. And I think that question that Jeremiah and Brandon both brought up about, like, along with everything depending on what side of the class divide you're on, but also being able to identify who the enemy is also the question of, if you can identify who the enemy is and also identify the ideals you're striving for, then that is the way out. You understand who needs to unite for what ideals. And I think that's something really missing today too, just this thing of unity, especially along with behavioral economics. And even I think when you were talking, Doc, about the Milton Friedman theory of economics, that it goes back to the individual. It talks about how, like, the key to equilibrium is letting individuals have individual freedom, the choice to starve or the choice to exploit. And completely misses the whole point of political economy, which is that economics cannot be talked about without the state. I think, I think this thing about unity and, like, the obscuring the way out, obscuring, like, what kind of unity is needed for what ideals against who. I think all of that is missing and is also part of the devastation. And because I think especially today, we've been talking a lot about China and, like, America, like, part of the enemy. I think even that, Jahan, the event on democracies, part of it is people talking about the enemy is China and all of that. I've been reading, along with Doc, I've been reading this biography of Judah, who is one of the military leaders of the People's Liberation Army on the Long March. And he has this quote where he's talking to Agnes Smedley, who's his biographer, and she's from a poor mining family in America. And she's relating her own experiences to his as a peasant, a very, very poor peasant, extreme poverty that, like, I've never even read about or heard about to that degree. And he says, the poor of the world are one big family. And I just think that aspect of unity, and this back to the definition that democracy is the opposite of poverty. I think like all of that is obscured by woke theory, by identity politics, by behavioral economics, by like the emphasis on appearance rather than essence, and the way ideologically people are talking about all of this. And I'm just so, I think like everyone else has been saying, the presentation you gave, Doc, this morning was so comprehensive, and also just, I'm still processing so much of it, because I think it described the crisis and also what is needed for a way out so clearly.
Well, listening to you speak sounds like you understand it better than I do. I mean, yeah, it's so clear. It clarified it for me listening to you. So I just wanted to say.
I'll bring in some comments. Michelle Liu writes, excellent explanation of the parallels between wokeness and market economics as tools of the ruling elite, which impose an ideology limiting the potential of general people to flourish. I studied and worked in behavioral economics for a few years, naively thinking it would be a good way for me to contribute to changing society. Over time, I became increasingly skeptical of how inane and arrogant the questions and solutions produced by behavioral economists are, imposing the doctrine of the ruling elite unnatural to the lives of general people. A popular behavioral economics concept, libertarian paternalism or nudging, is used to design solutions to trick people into making what they consider smarter, pro-social decisions, such as creating quirky, colorful trash cans to encourage people to throw their cigarette butts into. Their idea of pro-social is to force working people under the boot of ruling class assumptions and to keep them disenfranchised, completely atomizing away from what the real concerns and solutions for general people are. I think the rise of behavioral economics in the past few decades is a sign of how poorly equipped the intelligentsia are to deal with the real issues of society, and a thinly veiled attempt to literally manage the lives of the masses for the purpose of imperial hegemony.
Mm-hmm.
Ilana writes, more can be learned about behavioral economics from this Adam Curtis 4-episode series, The Century of the Self. I think it's a documentary series she shared a link to. Purva writes, why do people who go on and on about settler colonialism not denounce gentrification with the same passion?
Good
Frederick Schminke writes, Biden's public spending $6 trillion means that the ruling class is possibly afraid of its current position.
Mm-hmm.
Ron Enteronen writes, the Biden program will importantly be mainly based on the neoliberal public-private model, which ensures it will cost much more than a truly public program. Further, it will mostly be overseen by the corporations that have the work, rather than a real public works program. The labor will be subordinate to those corporations. It's a bailout for the corporations that get the contracts.
Yeah. Can I just add to that, Jahan? I want to come back to Michelle's point, because what she stated was actually really quite profound. When Doc was framing this conversation about behavioral economics, he was talking about economic theory becoming a branch of psychology.
Right.
And that is profound for me, because he's saying that the behavioral economists, people are not making decisions rationally, but the unconscious mind, psychological needs, important for marketing and for branding and for commodities. Mm-hmm. And then he talked about this very notion that modern day culture is an invention of a ruling elite that were committed to creating desires and needs and imagined needs. And so on the part of that population, so popular culture, marketing, one and the same, he said. And so that goes back, because that goes back to Michelle's point about hegemony, which I want to touch upon in 1 second, because Doc said popular culture creates desires, the things, the wants. And when we think about desires, what is a desire? It's something imagined, it's not actual, but you attach a certain feeling to it. You see what I'm saying? So now Doc is getting to, well, what makes up the contents of a desire? And this is where I think he's driving this point home. and he talked about gangster rap. We won't get into that. I know how Doc feels about rap music. Somebody gonna go there yet?
Some of it.
Yeah, we can talk about the last postal KRS One, some of that stuff. But he said success is using a capitalist value system. And I think that's the point that Michelle reminded me of. A couple summers ago, we were studying Antonio Gramsci,
Mm-hmm.
and we looked at the Marxist theory of cultural hegemony, which was associated with Gramsci.
Mm-hmm.
And it was that very notion that Michelle is hinting at, that the ruling class can manipulate the value system and the mores of a society. And that's the point. That's what I was reminded of in this thought process when she stated her statement. The ruling class, so that their view becomes the literal worldview.
Mm-hmm.
So even though it's a resetting of capitalism, it's a resetting of the worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why I think the book Race as a worldview is so important, because you're looking at racial capitalism. No, hold on a second now. We got to go back. You have this. So I wanted to make that point about cultural hegemony and Gramsci and this very idea that the ruling class can manipulate the value system and literally create that worldview, rebrand the worldview, if you will. If that makes any sense. I don't know if I made sense.
Makes all the sense in the world.
Okay, because sometimes Vincent will tell me if I make any sense. You know what I mean?
I think that is a very important point, especially because as the entire entertainment and cultural industry becomes totally subordinate to finance capital, these are the ways. This is almost like soft power, you could say, like countries exercise soft power. This is the soft power of finance capital. And it is very stark. I mean, we've talked about it a lot, about how much culture has changed from US music, particularly African-American music and films and literature. Everything has changed so dramatically from the 60s and 70s until now. It's almost unrecognized, but it seems like a lot of it is because of the total penetration of finance capital and the state into all elements of culture, and then exporting that culture abroad is also very important for the ruling elite.
And then the simple notion that what you were saying, Doc, about when you're accumulating things in a capitalist culture, that becomes more important than human values. So finance capital becomes way more important than the basic human values and the basic human needs of the working class people. And that, the market is all these unnecessary things. I mean, we need some basic human relief here, But that connection between behavioral economics and identity politics, I didn't make that connection, and that was a deep connection. As they play into each other theoretically, how they hold certain assumptions about who or about what is important. That I didn't make that a connection, Doc. So I'm glad that you brought that to my attention. That's the best way to look at it, I think. This identity politics, the individual is more important than anything else. Blame the individual failures, make the people themselves into failures, as opposed, it's like problem people versus people who face problems. You either turn the people themselves into problems, or the people are facing problems, and you entertain the causes of those problems. So that identity politics, the individual, the woke trope, the woke lifestyle, as you said, self-care, it's a lifestyle change, rebranding of capitalism, capitalist reset for self-care, individual need,
I think another theoretical trend we have to put on the table alongside racial capitalism and settler colonialism is this critical race theory that is currently being debated. I think we mentioned a few weeks ago about this debate about teaching critical race theory in schools. And I was doing a little bit of research on this, and there's an interesting interview that Mark Lamont Hill did on his show with Imani Perry, who's one of these rising stars in the African American studies world at Princeton right now. And it's actually quite revealing, because she comes out and says, her main criticism of the sort of critiques of critical race theory is that, in fact, nobody even knows what it is except for people in one, certain law schools, and two, graduate schools of education. Those two things. And, it makes me think, Doc, also about your point of this kind of inability of these theories to grasp this race class dialectic in any kind of serious way, because in some ways, okay, Imani Perry's saying, I've never even heard of critical theory being taught outside of those two environments. How are they teaching this in a public school in Texas?
Mhm.
But part of the sort of criticism of critical race theory, I think, has to be seen as a class critique as well of these particular institutions deciding essentially what curriculum is. I mean, where does curriculum get created? It's getting created in these graduate schools of education, who's theorizing sort of about how we talk about race or things like that in the schools. And I think, to again, like as you mentioned, the people, we have to take the people seriously. It's not just these macroeconomic trends, but how are people actually reacting to them? And something is sort of culture war like as this debate over critical race theory in schools, I think also has a class basis in this case. If people are not stupid and it's not lost on them what this kind of thing like critical race theory is coming out of, and what sections of American society it represents. So I mean, I think that was quite a revealing interview, actually, to have somebody come on who is supposed to explain what critical race theory is, to essentially say we shouldn't care about it because nobody knows what it is outside of these tiny elite institutions and graduate programs. But that's precisely part of the problem. I think that people, if not intellectually, are intuitively picking up on.
Yeah, Vincent, I just want to add to that. This is a conversation. So I listened to that. I saw the Mark LaMahill, the interview with Monty Perry, and it's interesting. So critical race theory is different than how Du Bois theorizes about race. You see, she broke down, and she was correct in her breakdown of what critical race, how it emerged, the idea of critical race theory being tied to the 70s, the American legal theory. But when we're talking about theorizing race, this is the point you're making. When we're talking about theorizing race, we're talking about it much more broadly. We're looking at really the crucial role of race in social domination, which is vastly different than just looking at race as a variable within legal theory. And so I was waiting for her, a brilliant scholar comes out of African American studies, to say that. And she missed the opportunity to say, okay, well, that's how it's conceptualized in American legal theory. But us scholars here in African American studies, we look at race as a worldview. We look at the system of white supremacy as a system of racial domination where race is, and she didn't say that point. And so she missed the crucial role of race in social domination. And that's what Du Bois is talking about when he's theorizing about race, which is vastly different than critical race theory. And so I was disappointed when Mark and her didn't get to that point, because that was a moment of clarity that was desperately needed, and therefore, again, obscuring the role of race in the construction of the empire, of white supremacy socio-political system.
But the question is, could they get to it, given their intellectual upbringing, their intellectual frameworks? Can they get to the point that you say that you wanted them to get to? And I am skeptical whether they can get to it. Now, I was reading an article in the Boston Review where the author was saying there's a difference, because I'm like Imani Perry. What is it? I have a big book of articles called Critical Race Theories from back in the 90s, early 2000s. And it's just a lot of people talking about what they call critical race theory. No one knows what it is. Kimberly Crenshaw is associated with creating this theory of intersectionality. But this author said there's a difference between critical race theory and critical race studies. That further obscures, some would say complicates. Let me just say this. This is why you have to understand how to understand academic discourse. For example, when they say, well, we have to complicate the question, I take that to mean we have to obscure its essence. Because in obscuring its essence, you give more space for academics to talk more. And pretty much that's what they're interested in, talking, not resolving anything, because everything is too complicated to resolve, because we can't know the truth or essence of anything. But if you take Kimberly Crenshaw and intersectionality, well, if that's critical race theory in the sense of a way to argue civil rights cases, okay, and I'll leave that to legal scholars and legal practitioners. But once you graft that on to a system defined by contradiction and the class race dialectic, by the way, dialectic is never used. They substitute the concept dialectic with intersectional. And this is a very significant move, I believe. Now, one could question binaries, be they formal or dialectical binaries, or whatever, and that's all good. But don't, how would I say, what I want to say? I think it is, and what we're experiencing, and this is why I agree with you all, you and Brandon and Vincent very, very much. This, I use this line, the dummying down of everything and the elevation of dummies to represent everybody. This is what is so, I mean, it's overwhelming. I know when I talk to Yvonne, if we could have an out and out discussion, debate, let's have it. But no, we're not going to have that, because what we're going to do is elevate dumbness to a level of that this is really intelligent. And this is a problem. And then if you don't go along with the dumbness, you got to be canceled. This is very, very, yeah.
Bring in some more comments on this topic. Raju writes, I agree with the analysis of racial capitalism and think it is important to criticize the concept of racial capitalism, both in its original iteration with Cedric Robinson and in its more recent form. The original Cedric Robinson version of the term was an attack on Marxist theory, particularly with regard to the transition from feudalism to capitalism. It also implicitly took an anti-Soviet, anti-communist position. In its more recent iteration, racial capitalism has become a meaningless term, where in practice, it is simply a way to be able to support Black Lives Matter as well as woke socialism. Even in the more sophisticated uses of the term, I think it is more an attempt to synthesize new forms of identity politics and cultural nationalism, along with a kind of democratic socialism and Trotskyism. Ultimately, the term goes against the legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois, and particularly his theorizing, which did not attempt to refute Marx's ideas, but rather to complete them. In practice, this meant engaging in the Black struggle for freedom, along with supporting anti-colonial struggles around the world, as well as the Soviet Union. Also, on that issue, I wanted to say that this Cedric Robinson, the academic who originated this term, and it has been very influential in academia. But I think, as Raj's comment shows, often the politics of it is not discussed, the political implications of that concept, particularly in the time. And Doc talked about this in the 80s. And also coming back to Black Agenda Report and Black Agenda Review, which is a new project by Black Agenda Report of academics. They're also now trying to argue that racial capitalism was before Cedric Robinson, or at least that it had a a basis in struggles, particularly in South Africa. I think some student group or something that used that term. So I think this is a very significant point to understand and to engage with, because this has been something very, very obscurantist. And again, because I think Robinson in his book also talks about Du Bois. So it's an attempt again of a rebranding, to try to rebrand the Black radical figures like Du Bois into the guise of racial capitalism and the kinds of politics which racial capitalism brings, rather than what they actually stood for. More comments from Frederick Shimke says, excellent point on Gramsci, Brandon. Very frightening how the superstructure is forged by the elite, the world of ideas, drowning out truth and propaganda. Shantanu Ghosh says, thank you for an incredibly eye-opening presentation on the present political economic climate. In World in Africa, Du Bois states that slavery was in essence not racial. Egypt had white slaves, but it was fundamentally different from the transatlantic slave trade. The slave trade degraded labor, degraded the worker, and oppressed a class of people rather than a single race. But eventually, in order to justify the slave trade, a reasoning based on race was put forth. Superiority of the white race started out as an excuse, but Du Bois reminds us that it all started out as the degradation of labor in order to satisfy European greed. I think this is important given the present context of the political economy, in which terms racial capitalism are becoming more and more common. Todd R. Doherty says, Emily Dong, can you expand a bit more on the relationship between democracy and poverty?
Yeah, that's something that comes from, that's not from me, that's from Du Bois. And it was a huge thing for me to read that through Du Bois's works, understanding democracy is not, because especially in the US, there's this idea of democracy as voting, or democracy as every individual gets to vote, gets a say by voting. But actually, or some people will say the opposite of democracy is authoritarianism, or the opposite of democracy. Some people will even say the opposite of democracy is socialism or communism. But actually, Du Bois says democracy is about opportunity. Like, democracy is about the ordinary person's opportunity to live a decent life, to flourish, to contribute to civilization, to contribute to culture. And so the opposite of democracy is actually poverty that prevents people from living a decent life, poverty that prevents people from being able to unleash their creative potential and actually participate fully in society. And that's also why in Russian America, he says that what links America and Russia is actually a shared ideal of democracy, true democracy, where there's no poverty, where there's no war, where there's no degradation of the worker, but where there's actually socialism, where the most privileged class of people is the worker, and if anything, the child of the worker. And that's something that both the US and both Russia should share in both their destinies and the people, what the people yearn for. But I actually don't remember where in Du Bois's works he talks about it. I know he talks about it in many places. Maybe Jahan or Doc, you guys actually know.
But Emily, that's also a good point in looking at Marx and the class struggle really being the unavoidable result of capitalism. What you're arguing and what Du Bois was suggesting is that what was becoming so evident was the fact that capitalism, as efficient as it was at building wealth, it was equally as efficient in producing poverty. And so it's, in other words, and that when Doc is talking about the crises of capitalism, every 4 to 7 years, you see a crisis of the capitalist cycle of sorts, either resulting in recessions, great recessions, or depressions, as he articulated in his presentation. But I think the point that I took from what Doc was saying is that what capitalism produces and what it reproduces is inequality and instability. And that's in that economic system, the inequality and instability is constantly being produced and reproduced in the capitalist system. and which is also tied to why there is such an attempt to rebrand, to disguise the limits of poverty. Oh, and I think in some ways it's like an underlying theory of appeasement. We just going to appease the mass of people just enough to, if the fire gets too hot, we're not going to put the fire out. We're not going to entertain the cause of the fire. We're just going to put a little water sprinkle just enough to get the psychological irritants of revolution really being appeased, if you will. And so just, can we lift them just enough that they won't be considered in poverty? This is why they underestimate the poverty threshold at 25,000 some change for a family of 4. I mean, what family of 4 can survive with 25? That's the poverty threshold. Even if you put it at 40,000, you're still vastly underestimating what it costs to survive in America. I think that's when Cornel West and Smiley wrote that book, A Poverty Manifesto, back in 2012 or so, when they were talking about 1 in 2 people living in or near poverty at the underestimated threshold of 25,000, and that the numbers of unemployment suggest we were probably close to that at this particular moment, especially with the inequality persisting, with billionaires and trillions of dollars going in certain directions. Largest transfer of wealth in human history just occurred from the bottom to the top. So your point on poverty is, in going back to the example of Du Bois and how he really described democracy, I think is very profound, because we oftentimes don't think of it that way at all. And Du Bois laid it out in Russian, an unpublished manuscript, sitting there with all his brilliance. And so I thank you for bringing that back to our attention about what democracy really is, and how it's supposed to protect the majority from the tyranny of the minority, which is the very opposite of what we have here today.
And Martin Wolf, I want to get back to that quote from Martin Wolf, when he says that, he goes through all of these things that are at stake, but he says, ultimately, what is at stake is democracy. Well, he doesn't say it, but I know he understands it, that democracy is a state form. So with our system, it is democracy that frees and privileges the rich and the richest. That's what we call bourgeois democracy. People's democracy, what Du Bois calls the dictatorship of the proletariat, a new state form. Interestingly, what the Chinese achieved when Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic of China, he was expressing the fact that a new state was being born, a new organization of power was coming into being, which, I hate to go here, but this is why, you can only see Bernie Sanders as a fake and a fraud, as a socialist. Maybe as a liberal, he's for real, but as a socialist, he's fake. Because, this democratic socialism, but by democracy, he's talking the same thing that Martin Wolf is saying, that we'll have socialism under the rule of the rich, a bourgeois socialism. That is why when asked, well, what could you give examples of socialism? He names all white countries. And he attacks Hugo Chavez. And socialism in Venezuela, a black and brown country. Their leader is a dead communist dictator. So if the people are in power, it's a dictatorship. If the bourgeoisie and rich are in power, it's a democracy. And we can go through all of the and tease out. Take racial capitalism, and I'm glad, Raj, you mentioned Cedric Robinson. That book is published in 1980, by the way. All of that talk about racial capitalism. But what about what Du Bois talks about? The dictatorship of the people, a new state. And that's the only way that that's the only democracy that will, in the end, eliminate poverty and inequality.
You know, just on this question of democracy, also, I'm really glad that we're spending some more time on this because this is very clarifying for me. But I was recently revisiting some lectures by the great political economist Michael Hudson. And, you know, he actually, in one of his talks, gives a definition of how the American ruling class defines democracy, which is essentially just, as he puts it, committing economic suicide in order to align with American economic interests. So basically, not producing one's own food, you basically have to have your country flooded by, you know, exports from the United States agriculture, and then the U.S. gets to use your natural resources. And, you know, most importantly, you have to do all of your exchanges in the U.S. dollar. And, you know, I think this is the opposite of Du Bois's definition of democracy, really, because it's an imposed form of poverty on the whole country. I mean, you're essentially agreeing, in order to be classified as a democracy that would go to this summit in Copenhagen, you either have to be, you know, one of the Western powers aligned with the US, or one of these countries that's essentially, you know, agreed to declare class war domestically in order to submit to these International Monetary Fund conditions. So, you know, I guess maybe we could return a little bit. I mean, I have a lot of questions also about what was brought up, Doc, in your presentation about, can Biden's program in this historical moment actually solve these contradictions? Because, you know, whether it's, I mean, this sort of, we want to have butter and guns, we want to have our cake and eat it too, has, in the view of people like Hudson, worked since we got off the gold standard in 1971, because the US can just print unlimited currency to pay off its debts and just spend on all these 800 military bases, and, you know, without any consequences. And it's really the only country in the world that's allowed to just do that without imposing austerity on its own population in a huge way. But it seems like all of that rests on this ability to have the dollar as the currency, the reserve currency of the whole world. And that the only way that you can do this unlimited fiscal spending is through that. And if there is an alliance between these countries like China, Iran, Russia, and on, that are a critical mass that can actually move away from the dollar, it might put the United States in a position, a very dire position, even domestically, about how it could actually do these spending programs and spend on all of these military bases. So I'm just wondering, Doc, if you could talk more about that, or other people. But I think it's a really important question that no one's really addressing right now.
I think the very fact of the way you put it on the table helps to clarify what the contradiction is. That's another word that the woke people never use. You know, it's almost a situation where the system is in an antagonistic contradiction with itself. And you're right. And you know, that's why Keynes is so appealing, because, you know, he says the general theory of employment, interest, and money. And money is very important in what Keynes does, because he talks about money in terms of the British pound at that time and the US dollar, and how each of them were necessary to maintain Western dominance over trade and investment. Well, of course, that was still the colonial time. The world was more or less colonized. But you have to have, if it's not gold, you have to have a currency that is dominant and around which the dominant economies agreed to organize trade, investment, interest rates, loans, and so on. So once you get into the IMF World Bank orbit, let's say you're Ghana or you're Cote d'Ivoire or South Africa, once you're in that orbit, you are bound to the dollar and all of the machinations that go on with the trading and manipulating of the dollar as the reserve currency. You see what I'm saying? You're locked in a situation you cannot win in, but then you can't get out of. But here is, by the way, with Jahan's talk of the conference on democracy, led by Biden with his record. But anyway, well, what is it? It's not about democracy. It's about the maintenance of US hegemony, which means, as you point out, the dominance of the dollar. Martin Wolf is a Britisher. He's not an American, but he feels the fate of Britain and of the West is tied up with whether or not Biden is successful. A hot civil war in the United States is the worst nightmare, not just for the US ruling class, but for the ruling classes of all of the European countries. Now, but we're in the moment of, quote, wokeness. So the democracies of the world will not just be, as with Bernie Sanders, Norway and the white nations as the socialist, democratic, liberal countries. Now you have to bring in South Africa and you have to bring in India and maybe a couple of more dark countries to make it look woke and to make it look diverse and to make it appear that the values of Western imperialism and US imperialism in particular are universally applicable. And this is why, politically, the Modi government in India is doing a disservice to the Indian people, but for whatever reasons, aligning it with the US in the US war against China. You're not helping India, you're not helping Asia. You are doing the opposite. Because if India is bound to the US dollar, rather than, let us say, a basket of currencies, India will be locked in a debt cage, a trap that they can't get out of. And India will never develop its full potential. It will never do what China has done, and that is wipe out poverty and extreme poverty. India will never do it if it is bound by the rules of the IMF and the World Bank and is tied to the US dollar. The rupee is a currency of significance or importance only to the extent that it's tied to the dollar right now, which is another form of neocolonialism.
Doc, let me ask you a quick question. Do you think this in part is why Kamala Harris became the vice president for the appeal?
I don't know. I have no idea about that.
Well, I'm just thinking about her identity and the appeal of trying to get India in alignment with America and the
I think
agendas.
that alignment would occur under the Modi regime with or without Kamala Harris. It is something deeper, and I don't quite understand. I know Vincent has lived in India, and Jahan knows more about everything than anybody. So I don't know. What is the political culture of India that predisposes it to a Western hegemon over an Asian neighbor?
we can also we can ask free school members in India to comment on that.
I hope, oh yeah, I forgot about that.
The first-hand perspective. Also, in a lot of ways, I think the crisis of this neoliberal model very sadly is being seen in the public health crisis in India right now. Kind of tragedy. And so, I mean, there's a lot of contradictions over there in South Asia generally. But I also wanted to add that the other part of this whole equation of what they're trying to put together with the alliance of democracies is the internal class struggle within the Western countries and the contradictions. That's the other thing, which they're finding very difficult to control, which is why part of this theme is the struggle against disinformation. In other words, the struggle against other ideologies, anything that takes you off the ruling class's script, whether it's from the right or the left, so-called. So, here, of course, the Trump movement, that Trump populism is something which they do find very threatening, which they want to get under control in the name of controlling disinformation and stopping quote unquote white supremacist terrorism. Similarly, recently, interestingly, there was an election in Scotland in which a Scottish nationalist parties won, and they said that if they were to win a majority, they would go for another referendum to leave the United Kingdom. So that's another thing on the agenda, another big contradiction the West is facing, along with many others. I mean, throughout France, in Germany, all these places are having massive either protests or political rebellions of various kinds. So, I mean, the West has a very weak hand in keeping all this together.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But some more comments as well from from Shambarta Chatterjee. He writes, "Thank you, Doc, for such a clarifying lesson about the distinction between modern economic theories and political economy. From my naive understanding of developmental economics, which is mostly concerned with policy making in developing nations, it seems that an underlying assumption is that working people only operate on the basis of rational choices that benefit individuals without any regard to governing bodies that represent them. An example I recently came across is about quote unquote ostracization amongst farmers in India, where the focus of US-based economists is to offer incentives to individual farmers to discourage ostracization. Nor in these studies do panchayat decisions feature. Panchayats are like the local village councils in India. Nowhere in these studies do panchayat decisions feature. And if these oppose economist models, they are immediately branded as regressive and against individual farmers. It seems a bizarre assumption that completely removed academics' understanding of. It seems a bizarre assumption that completely removed academics' understanding farmers' plight more than their own elected bodies." Meghna has a comment. "The distinction between economics and political economy is so clarifying. Who the economy will work for is a matter of politics, who the state will act on behalf of, not individual initiative. It was also clarifying to realize that identity politics and wokeness is based on the same fundamental assumptions, the same assumptions as market fundamentalism, and is equally as superficial. Another parallel to woke market fundamentalism is neighborhood revitalization by universities. The idea is that universities, which are institutions of social good and wokeness, will revitalize neighborhoods by investing in neighborhoods, purchasing locally, hiring people, and bringing a professional class back to cities. They don't mention that neighborhoods have been destroyed in the first place by disinvestment and the withdrawal of the state, and that professional managerial class is meant to displace the working class Black population, who will also be automated out of their jobs and destroy their institutions, and to capitalize on depressed land values. We need the clarity of political economy to understand all this, which is precisely why it is not taught in institutions of higher learning."
Oh yeah. And to Meghna, even David Harvey, the radical geographer, urban geographer, I think fails at the point of engaging political economy. Interestingly, in the way that Meghna is attempting to do in her dissertation. by going to Du Bois and the concept of Black labor, the Black worker. It's very interesting. That move, Meghna, that move in and of itself upsets, overturns, or upsets an existing framework of analysis in its liberal and so-called radical construal. Very interesting. I very much agree with what Meghna's saying there.
Well, she's also making a really powerful point. When you were referencing the political economy as being really more adequate to understand systemic crisis, you were talking about, I think you suggested in some ways, certain people had seized or commanding heights of the financial, industrial, and I think the trading monetary systems. I think that was what you said. And Meghna is saying the same thing, in making the most of the systems, who do they represent?
That's right.
And that's very, so
if I could interrupt you,
please
but
do.
that is why these representatives must appear to be objective, technical people. That's what Michelle Yu was saying. She studied statistics at one of the best or the best business school in the nation, maybe the world. And what it did was to take her further and further away from people and closer to the discourse of experts in the field of economics, which means what they call modeling, to model the ideal economy, and then to gradually apply the model to existing economic relationships. Well, the fact of the matter is you start from the model and go to the actual. I'm always reminded, we talk a lot about Marx today. Marx made the statement, ascending to the concrete. The model builders, the bourgeois academic model builders, feel to go to the concrete is to descend. That the model is the example of pure knowledge. And knowledge gets corrupted as it becomes more concrete. Marx said that the ideal or the model is but the lower level, that as you ascend to the concrete, you come closer to the truth. And this is and I know for our work, truth is discovered in its complexity, not in its simplicity. And this is the grappling that we're always doing. And this is, I feel so grateful to be a part of this platform of discussion. You know what I'm saying? This is very enriching for me because we get closer and closer to complexity. And that is the point of science, to understand things not in their pure form, but in their complex forms.
The comment from oh, sorry.
While you're figuring it out, John, let me just say this. Doc, you know what that reminded me of?
Go ahead.
I can't remember where Du Bois states it, but remember he says, he talks about, he gave up search for absolute truth, and then he was not from doubt to the existence of reality, but the limited knowledge and clumsy methods of the times. Remember that research made it impossible really to completely apprehend truth. I can't remember the exact quote, but he used the idea of asymptotes of a hyperbola. You remember that?
Yeah.
So perhaps,
That's in a letter to Herbert Aptheker.
Oh, that's what it was, the letter to Herb Aptheker. Okay, I couldn't remember. It gradually says, the provable truth, approach it like the asymptotes of a hyperbola. Yeah. Getting nearer and nearer and nearer, you get never really getting a chance to meet truth in that sense. So that's what it reminded me of, the complexity of truth. That Du Bois quote. It was a letter to Herb Aptheker, that's what it was?
It's a letter to Herbert Aptheker.
So that must have been in the 50s then, I guess, right? He must have wrote that probably in the 50s then, I guess.
Right, 1956.
56, okay.
So comment from Frederick Schminke. He writes, Schminke, sorry. The arrival of the idea of intersectionality, initially from the ideas of Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, Afrofeminism, has made it difficult to discuss class issues. Marxist ideas are even accused of being class reductionist, and hitherto tread a thin line of being potentially canceled. Confusing and putting all oppressions and oppressed on the same plane, how can proponents of intersectionalism be engaged with, as they seem to have a monopoly on the discussion at this time?
Right. And I would say in defense of Kimberly Crenshaw, that she was just making creating a framework for legal arguments. She was not trying to explain social contradictions. And I hope she still sticks to the limitations of her initial project. And to make it more expansive is it's just a fraud. It can't do that. It's not set up to do that logically.
Actually, I wanted to ask you about, what about this other person, Derek Bell? He's also credited, right?
Yeah. Yes. And because, Derek Bell was a professor at Harvard's law school, and he went on a strike and eventually was fired because he was protesting that they hire a Black woman in the law school. But Derek Bell's writing is of a different genre, different quality, and is not cited by any of the woke people. Derek Bell's Faces at the Bottom of the Well is his, I think, important work of essays, where he writes in almost a, Socratic dialogic way about issues of race and race marginalization, race inequality. And somewhat like, it sometimes reminds you of Souls of Black Folk. But he, like Crenshaw, was trying to inform civil rights legal discourse with and especially him, with actual, what we in sociology call ethnography, experience. You see what I'm saying? Rather, and to put meat on the bones of civil rights legal argumentation and writing. That's what he was trying to do. It's something quite different than what we see going on today, which is more about identity and liberating, and these are quotes, the individual from oppressive identities so she or he can express their real or actual identity. Sounds familiar?
Well, that's also why I like how you mentioned Rudolph Hilferding's Finance Capital book.
Yeah.
When you had mentioned that, you were talking about the ways in which capitalism is taking over the big banks, big financial institutions. But the thing, then you said something about, I can't remember the exact phrase, but you talked about when it was going, rather than industrial policy, was financial policy.
Absolutely. It's you see it today. There's no, it's very interesting. I think Vincent asked about this. Does Biden have an industrial policy? Is it to re-industrialize those parts of the United States which were ruthlessly deindustrialized? No. Why? The point is that he wants to save the working class while at the same time saving finance capital, the biggest banks and financial institutions and hedge funds and on and on and on. So, but freedom for the banks and the financial class is the freedom to export capital, not to invest in the United States. To invest in the United States would be an industrial policy. But that's at odds, antagonistic to the class interest of finance capital. And that's why, Lenin talked about imperialism as a system and as a stage of capitalist development, where capital is exported to the cheapest labor areas, because ultimately you want to make production cheap. Now, apropos China, China became one of those countries to which capital has been exported. I mean, massively, probably more than any country in history. But China was not neo-colonized in the process. Because, and this is the thing, this is Du Bois, Emily. It is the dictatorship of the people. Who has state power? You know what I'm saying? And for the most part, in China, there was not an ambiguity of state power. This Chinese thing is not to be taken lightly. And that's why they refer to it as an autocracy, a dictatorship, and everything else. But that was the difference in China. And that's what makes China different from India. The state in India is not, the state is a coalition, a conflicting coalition of forces. Whereas in China, as Mao said in October 1949, he declared the People's Republic of China. Everything then pivots upon that notion of a People's Republic. And that's how they were able to, forgive me for talking too much, but that's how they were able to navigate the contradictions of foreign capital and socialist development in what can be called a new economic policy, where you did not have enough capital to leap to socialism, but you had a political leadership who in the medium and long run were committed to socialism. But we'll talk about that in the conference on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, but I keep going back to this idea of contradictions and looking at the Bidenomics, for example.
That's right.
So you have this two-party oligopoly, if you will, of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
They both support capitalism. It's just a matter of how best to do that, which is the theories that you laid out.
They both support finance capitalism.
Finance capitalism.
This is very important. And they're both more or less serving finance capital.
Yeah. And I think
that's why as a socialist, you can't take Bernie Sanders but so seriously, or AOC.
Yeah.
They're not very serious, because the question is, as they attempt to ascend the political system, and especially AOC, whose interests are you serving?
Mm-hmm.
By the way, in Manhattan? Come on.
And this is the point that the contradiction to me is, so you're going to have all this federal spending now, right?
Right.
That flows where? Right into corporate hands, who are going to reproduce that very same finance capital system that was the system that neglected the infrastructure and created the income and wealth inequality over many decades. That's a grave contradiction. So that very same system is going to it can't, by its very nature, it cannot solve the problems and the crises, because that is what was responsible for the neglected infrastructure.
That's Vincent's question right there. I would bet against it working.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? But we'll have to see. And I mean, we're going to have, we're not in power, but we want to empower the people. So we're going to have to, navigate through all of this and fight, for ideological clarity. What the hell is going on? What are the contradictions? What are the contradictions? Is Biden just a nice grandfatherly, cat with dementia? Or is he representing certain class interests?
And that was also Jeremiah's point when he talked about identifying the enemy. He's also, I'm taking what you said, Jeremiah, is also looking at the ways in which America's scapegoating as methods of mass distraction for us as well. We're gonna point to China, that's a scapegoat. It's a form of trying to drift further, demonizing immigrants, if you will. Elections, whatever the case is, getting away from the questions of economics and politics and the grave decline. Now the system's in grave decline. There's no question about it. The leaders, the problem is they cannot see that internal production structure of US capitalism as being problematic whatsoever. I think, Jeremiah, you hit it on the head when you said that, identifying the enemy and identifying the problem correctly. I agree completely with you.
And I would just add one other word, identifying the contradictions.
Yeah, because one of the things that you had said earlier, Doc, that I was still thinking about was how academics always use that framing of, oh, we need to complicate the questions, And then I was trying to sort of figure that out also with this thing about truth, you discover it in its complexity. But I think actually I was like reflecting, I guess, on like my own experience, but when they talk about like, the complexity of things, like the academics and like activists, whatever, it actually is like when you boil it down, it's a very shallow and simplistic thing where everything's about you and like my story, my truth, whatever, the sort of postmodern thing. But actually, like when you look at it in its essence, it's a very simplistic way of viewing the world, and it's something which does not take into account or doesn't even understand or attempt to understand the broader complexity of society, the contradictions involved, and all of that stuff. And yeah, I don't know. I guess that was how I was trying to sort of reconcile like those two things. And then also on the topic of like democracy, I remembered a few weeks ago, I think Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, he had come out with a statement that said, democracy is not Coca-Cola, which with a syrup produced by the United States tastes the same across the world. The world will be lifeless and dull if there's only one single model and one single civilization. And I think it's so, I don't know, it's just so apt, and it's so accurate in terms of assessing how the US and how Jahan talked about like this so-called Alliance for Democracy, they're basically trying to reassert and reestablish sort of the dominance of Western civilization over the world and its model of what it thinks is democracy. And it's interesting because it's like people like AOC, like they're the ones who are on the forefront of being like, oh, we need to protect our democracy. They're always using that framing of like, oh, like January 6th was an attack on our democracy. And so they're the ones who are actually leading the attacks on like the Trump people and the people who are at the January 6th protests and all of that stuff, which I feel like it betrays or it shows just like where their allegiance lies, what it is that they're trying to preserve, what kind of order they're trying to preserve. But yeah.
Or as Malcolm X used to say, we've never seen democracy. We've only seen disguised hypocrisy.
Another comment from Emil. He writes, what does success mean when detached from programs for peace? What does wealth in a society mean when developed from the poverty of warfare worldwide? Very important questions. Purba writes, I recently found out about an article titled Neo-Marxism and the Bogus Theory of Racial Capitalism, which appeared unsigned in Equeze, a Black liberation journal of Southern African political analysis in October 1979, before quoting Cedric Robinson's thesis. Quoting from the article, the neo-Marxist tendency in South African analysis has disregarded the teachings of Lenin and Stalin on the national and colonial question, and has put forward the theory of racial capitalism in analyzing South Africa. This apparently ultra-revolutionary theory betrays the aspirations of a handful of white leftists to play a leading struggle in the Azanian liberation struggle, end quote. The same aspiration is, I think, what we are seeing with the new language of racial capitalism and the Black Lives Matter movement.
You know, that's very interesting, and I wanted to also return, I think, to what Raju had said about how Cedric Robinson wanted to refute Marx, whereas Du Bois wanted to complete Marx. And I think that, I mean, that's been in the back of my mind since that comment was read out, because I think, at least in the free school, you know, we're trying to sort of synthesize or complete human thought from many corners of the world and many different traditions. I mean, even Doc, in your presentation today, you know, Lenin alongside Keynes, alongside Hilferding, you know, I mean, not necessarily just rejecting certain tendencies completely. And I think what a lot of these woke theories have done is they have just sort of cleared the ground for this superficiality, you know, because, oh, we don't want anything to do with what came before. There's nothing good in that. We're going to refute that and start over, rather than, you know, let's look at it in its complexity or its totality or its contradiction and then move from that position. So, I mean, I think that's such an important point on methodology as well, and just in how we think about these past texts and theories.
Yeah, I mean, also just the method of actually studying the theories of political economy. That's, I mean, even that is totally abandoned now.
Yeah.
I think any social justice oriented person in the university will pretty much never study any history of political economy. And actually, it's quite interesting that, I mean, one of the major tasks that Marx himself actually did was to go through the theories of political economy and understand each one's strengths and weaknesses in order to develop, you know, a critique of political economy and his own theory of capital. I mean, that was something that was very fundamental, again, as you were saying, to the Marxism through Hilferding and then Lenin. They all were engaged in this process. Even, I mean, in some ways it's similar what we've done in free school, like when we've read through Kendi and Wilkerson and all the others, trying to understand what are the leading theories. Those are much worse, man. I wish we read through David Ricardo and those people. I would much rather have done that. But you know, it was what was needed. So this whole process of, in order to actually have a progressive vision for moving forward, you have to understand what are the leading theories and what are the strengths and weaknesses. What are they actually arguing? And that helps you to develop a critique and also to then provide some kind of vision for the way forward. And I mean, again, this dumbing down is the ultimate tactic of the ruling class, because when you're dumbed down and you don't understand basic things of how the government works, how the economy works, who the ruling elite is, then it's so easy to be manipulated. You can be manipulated to protest this thing, protest that thing, do this trendy thing, get into this lifestyle activism. But you have to have this, you know, intellectual base to know, you know, what's happening.
Yeah, Jahan, if I could just add to, go ahead, Doc.
The concept of critical theory is not new itself. Critical theory goes back to the 1920s in the Frankfurt School of Social Research in Germany, in Berlin. The word critique is different, I think, from critical theory. Critique is to investigate. So when Marx entitled Das Kapital a critique, it was to mean an investigation. Critical theory going back to the Frankfurt School, was at best and I put quotes, a neo-Marxist project, which said that Marx was wrong about the class struggle. Look at what happened with World War I. And therefore, we had to synthesize Marxist theory with Freudian psychoanalysis, which ended up being Freudian psychoanalysis kind of reshaped or rethought through some of Marxist concepts. This, by the way, is the absolute opposite of what Antonio Gramsci was doing. So from the standpoint of Marxism, although Gramsci introduces new ideas such as hegemony and so on, Gramsci is closer to Lenin than critical theory is to Marx or Lenin. Critical theory became a decidedly petty bourgeois framing of questions of society, emphasizing the despair, nihilism, loss of hope, loss of purpose of the individual.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. I remember many, many years ago when I had a chance to take the Du Bois seminar with Doc, he had made the comparison similar to Einstein and Newton. It was Du Bois and Marx, and he called, and this is not me, this is what Doc said, so I'm just remembering because I'll never forget it. Doc said Du Bois was the Einstein of the social sciences, and I remember thinking how profound that was, because in looking at Einstein, you have this the general theory of relativity, which was at the time was the new understanding of gravity in the universe, and so it encompasses all of our understandings of gravity that came to us from Newton.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily replace it, but it encloses it, if you will. So Newton's laws still work, but they're under sort of a restricted regime of intensity, if you will. So when Newton's laws break down, you need a new understanding of gravity to describe what's going on. And I thought the same when you said you explained it the same way with Marx and Du Bois. And that's what Vincent's point is as well, talking about how Du Bois transcends some of the limitations to Marx's analysis when you add race and social production into the equation in such a way. So I just wanted to say that because that was, for me, talking about science, talking about where Du Bois comes in this equation with, we talked a lot about Marx, but how in some ways, when you did an analysis of Black Reconstruction, go ahead, Doc, you can.
Well, I just want to say, Newton and Einstein, what Newton introduces is motion. And therefore, it reconfigures the categories that Newton had discovered. They were static categories, but the general theory of relativity added the factor of motion measured in time. Guess I just wanted to say that. One small thing like that creates a whole new paradigm of physics.
Which I also think is what you suggested about how Du Bois's Black Reconstruction creates a whole new paradigm of American historiography.
I think so.
Another comment from Caleb. He writes, "This has been a wonderful and tremendously clarifying discussion. Thank you all. The ideas brought up today reminds me a lot of what Du Bois discusses in the Propaganda of History, which motivated his own research and intellectual projects. How philosophy and sociology cannot be divided, but also how a historical and scientific understanding of human action produces a moral obligation to transform society. Du Bois's monumental contributions to social science and the movement for peace and justice demonstrates just how much he embodied this belief. He He saw ideas as oriented towards humanity, not isolated, and meant only for advancing your own self. In the social sciences, academics see knowledge as being removed from people and any sort of morality, or they see ideas as only having an unprincipled connection to activism or public policy. Today's intellectuals and academics fall so short of the standard, Du Bois said. Yeah, definitely. I mean, Du Bois is really a master at having a broad kind of education and applying. Like when he's talking about history, he's also talking about philosophy and sociology and political economy. And you could rearrange it. It's always, all of those are there. And of course, I mean, nobody can compare with Du Bois, like we were saying. But even with looking at Marx's method and comparing the Marxian approach to what you see today, I mean, one of the things that I've always found stood out to me when I tried to read works like Capital is how philosophical it is. Like he doesn't separate political economy from philosophy. In fact, I think his PhD thesis was in philosophy. He started out as a philosopher, then became interested in political economy. So Capital is as much a work of philosophy as it is of political economy. And then historical materialism is also very much there. Du Bois, in some ways, is also bringing in sociology because the father of sociology in the United States, and a number of other things. I mean, he's just at another level, like we're saying. But all of that, I mean, the kind of social science being put out is so impoverished compared to that. I mean, you hardly in graduate training in history, for example, like you learn almost actually literally no philosophy, no political economy, and then and then the actual theory and methods of history is so poor, so impoverished. They hardly even teach the kinds of the European canon that people like Marx and Du Bois were at least taught in their programs. So, I mean, you can clearly see that it's an attempt to totally dumb down and control the intellectuals as well. And I mean, in order to succeed as an intellectual in the university, it's no surprise you have to be somebody who just compromises with this agenda. And then even as we were speaking before, the ways in which behavioral economics and behavioral psychology is connected to identity politics. If you go to a university department, you can find this kind of reactionary work being waged in the Department of Psychology, this kind in the Department of Economics, this kind in the Department of Sociology or History, all of it you can find, communications, yeah, I mean, you name it.
And how that fits into the business school.
Right, absolutely. So it's like, where's the free thought? It's all basically fitting the agenda of the state. And then, you can bring in speakers on democracy who happen to be activists from Hong Kong or presidents of countries like Taiwan or BLM activists for that matter. So yeah, and all of it is heavily connected to money.
Can I just say one thing about critical theory and behavioral economics? Again, critical theory, as it was originally formulated, was a neo-Freudian, neo-Marxist synthesis, emphasizing the psychological needs of individuals, for good or bad. Well, critical race theory is a derivative of critical theory. And it is therefore a deeply psychological project. And you're right, it has very little in common with Du Bois, because Du Bois is sociological, historical, and so on. Here you have, and then the other thing about Freudian psychology, it is static, it is essentialized. In other words, there are a set of static subconscious drives and desires. They are always the same. They are essential to the human psychological makeup. Well, critical race theory. What does it say? And this is why you get a pushback. What it says, in essence, is that at the core of racism is the bad faith and deep psychological, subconscious desires of white folk. If you went from critical race theory to critical gender theory, it would say that all men are driven by unconscious desire to dominate women. It is a centralized, static, psychotherapeutic method. Take Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. You understand? The title itself gives it away. It is not about fighting for the liberation of the victims of white supremacy, who the whole society, if you read Baldwin, but it is a way of purifying and bringing to my attention my own deep-seated, unconscious racial motivations and drives. This is why Kendi can write an article in the Atlantic, here we are, back to the Atlantic, on denial, right? Not new with Kendi. He didn't make it up. But it is anchored to this notion of subconscious drives that you are denying are motivating you to behave in a white supremacist way. I mean, it is a mix of all kinds of nonsense or theories. If you go back, forgive me for talking a little too long. If you go back to Berlin in the 1920s, at least they knew enough philosophy and theory to say what they were doing. You come up 100 years later, these people don't even know the foundations of the theory that they're expounding. Or do they realize the implications of it? How to be in other words, it's a text for white folks. How to purge yourself of your conscious and pretty much more than conscious, unconscious drives. White supremacy is a drive, a psychological need, not a systemic need. In a moment of a systemic crisis, we could say more, but you see the point. I mean, in fact, you talk about it too long, you arrive at the conclusion. It's very diabolical, very hurtful, and they want to use very violent towards the working masses.
Well, and I think that's what makes it so insidious is this,
That's
the authors themselves don't know the intellectual history, or as they would like to say, genealogy of where they're coming from. I mean, and it just seems like this critical just gets stamped on to just about anything now. I mean, because I was even just reading some of this classic introduction text on critical race theory, and all of it is, for them, queer studies, critical feminist theory, it's all kind of part of the same thing. And it is also that inability to sort of distinguish within your analysis. And the fact that the people even writing this stuff now are unaware of where it's coming from is the most concerning thing, because it really is just the blind leading the blind at this point. And then more people are being, so-called educated into this kind of way of thinking, and are more and more detached from where it actually came from, every single year, really.
Right. And you saw it in Black studies when they went from sociology and history to postmodern cultural theory. And again, critical race theory is a culture theory. Racial capitalism is a culture theory. And by culture, I mean, something to be studied either anthropologically or psychologically.
Well, and then this idea too of this sort of, you hear a lot of people in Black studies now talk about the permanence of racism, for example, as a sort of ontological condition, basically. That, and I think this is where the resistance to things like critical theory, even on the level of people who are not college educated, they can pick up that it's essentially this, again, like you said, ahistorical and also just deeply nihilistic philosophy that says race is just inbred in not even just white people, but everyone, and that we're sort of locked into this system that no one can ever get out of. And essentially, I mean, at its most cynical level, it almost feels like a way for people to continue having a job writing these books. Because if nothing ever changes or gets better, well, you have job security forever, just kind of meditating on the inner psychological, problems that are never actually going to change. And I think, it's sad to see people, I think, who even are doing good work get sucked into this kind of permanence theory or this kind of ontological theory of race, essentially.
But it has to be permanent in this ontological sense, because it comes from a unconscious desire. And that's Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. It is, as you put it, ontological in the sense of subconscious need, subconscious desire. That's all over the discourse. Once you dig what they're doing and what it's connected to, it makes all the sense in the world. Like when Kendi says, I'm not going to excuse Black people who are also racist. Now, from a sociological, historical standpoint, we say, well, that can't be. He said, I don't care if they don't have power. But what he's saying is they have the same white supremacist drives and needs as white folk. He never makes the case strong, but that's kind of what he's gesturing to.
This is also why I think Johan's point when he's framing Du Bois is so crucial, as Du Bois is uniting history with philosophy to produce sociology. And it's the same token, if you just get stuck on what critical race theory is, as all of you have eloquently described it, you miss the fact that when Du Bois was theorizing about race, yes, he's looking through the prism of race, but he's also looking at class and economic interest into the analysis. And that's his engagement with Marx. Marx's work, it's rooted in what? The study of production, the study of relationships, what happens when producing wealth, what happens when producing commodities, what becomes indispensable in that whole process. And so, but you also need the social framework, which is where Du Bois is coming into so it becomes more holistic, if you will, which I think the point that Jahan was making in looking at things more holistically at the complexity of truth. And you're looking at Du Bois speaking of the role of race within a global social system of white supremacy within which capitalism is operating. And so and then it comes back to your earlier point about economic and political system of capitalism coming into production where social relationships are necessary, but this is very powerful. They're coming into the world racialized. And that was the point about racial capitalism that Raju was talking about as well. But whether it's empirical sociology, whether it's historiography with Black Reconstruction, I think that is the paradigm that Jahan and you're describing as a critique of critical race theory, as Vincent was talking about the limitations to how it's being perpetuated and taught and described, and what ontological framework it's being considered to erupt or to emerge from within, which is why Du Bois is, without question, and this, I think, without question, the intellectual architect. And I find it so interesting that I have not heard his name this outside of the free school, of course, anywhere in academic discourse. I might throw my television out today, to be honest with you. I might just give I mean, but I mean, not mention, I mean, in a moment of great crisis, nobody is turning to Du Bois. Nobody is turning to Baldwin. Nobody is seriously reading the civil rights movement as a critique of the Black Lives Matter movement.
That's so interesting, Brandon.
Nobody.
Racial reckoning.
In a moment of
Baldwin are not mentioned.
not mentioned once. I mean, unless you get some bullshit book that comes out, but that's about, you know. And yet we should be running towards, you know, as Emily was talking about, towards these thinkers, towards this type of analysis. You know, and I think that was the last point that you made, Doc, of your presentation. You know, when you're talking about these ideas and notions about the path to resolution, how did you put, you said it was a principled approach to ideas and ideological struggle. And I said, that's it. That's the point that I think we're all making here, is this principled approach, one, to ideas, to ideological clarity, and to the ideological struggle, which is why nobody's mentioning Du Bois or Baldwin or King or any of these deeper thinkers or these critiques of these movements. It's all about that individual behavior economics, as you described. It's so clear to me that the way in which this presentation, the way in which this dialogue has functioned to bring things in such clarity. So I appreciate this conversation tremendously, because I was in a bad place thinking about CNN and shit, you know.
Hey man, don't throw out your TV yet though, because the consumer price index is at a 12-year high. And price of televisions is going up along with used cars, plywood, gasoline.
Hey, don't have an accident with your car either, man.
Yeah, right. Bidenomics is coming for everybody. More comments. Nabila writes, I so agree. Universities are requiring people to pay for corrupt or stagnated so-called education.
That's it.
Kathy writes, the discussion on wokeness and identity politics as a distraction from a real analysis of today's crisis from a political economy standpoint reminds me of the ideas of another thinker closely related to Du Bois, Henry Winston. In his book, Strategy for a Black Agenda, Henry Winston was against staunchly cultural nationalism, people like Stokely Carmichael, Black separatism, and the so-called skin strategy, which cut the Black struggle off from its allies in the Soviet Union, or even among other progressive tendencies, weakening the struggle and thus playing right into the hands of monopoly capitalism. Quote, cultural nationalists fail to distinguish between the capitalist and the working class, fail to see the working class as the only revolutionary class. In essence, they not only reject unity between Black and white workers, they also reject the leadership role of Black workers in the liberation movement for that of the Black nationalist bourgeoisie, end quote. Replace cultural nationalism with identity politics and wokeness, and it feels like it describes today's moment very well.
Yep.
Meghna has a comment. The ideological bait and switch we have been discussing has a parallel to the misinformation campaigns conducted by the CIA in the third world to confuse people about the source of their backwardness, to say, quote, it's your fault.
Mm-hmm.
We can't forget the role of the CIA in disrupting the democratic strivings of the people through the assassination of leaders because they stood against the Western world order. I'm reading a book by Indian freedom fighter and trade unionist Pandit Shil Bhadra Yaji called CIA Operations Against the Third World, where he exposes their modus operandi in creating confusion and misinformation about the enemy through the deployment of missionaries, westernized intelligentsia, and falsely named Gandhian NGOs. As he writes, quote, the barrage of publicity was and remains so fierce because the desired goal is not only to manipulate public opinion, but also to create a bias strong enough to mislead the inquiry into the assassination of Indira Gandhi, to put it on the wrong scent, to defeat the very purpose of the inquiry, and to make it arrive at the conclusion so favored by the gang of imperialist terrorists that the assassination was the act of lone killers, that there was no foreign hand in manipulating the background orchestra of the media and the foreground trigger pulling of the marionettes, end quote. Well, it's also quite ironic that now they're forming committees against disinformation, because that's been the specialty of the CIA, the misinformation and disinformation campaigns. And if the media was bad back then, I mean, now the media is just openly a wing of they openly have CIA agents, and they're like, oh, this is the authority. John Brennan, former head of the CIA, plenty of other people associated with CIA generals. These are our impartial analysts.
Yeah, it also reminds me of that the woke CIA ad that was very heavily, I guess, circulating on the internet recently. I don't know if you've seen it, Doc, but it was interesting just seeing the discourse on it on social media, just because there was a lot of people trying to say like, oh, the CIA is co-opting woke, or like co-opting these like identity politics things. It was like, no, actually the CIA invented identity politics. Now they're just being more open about it. And so I feel like it kind of throws the so-called left into a kind of like identity crisis, because they're like, oh no, like the CIA is like co-opting us. And it's like, no, actually, like you're pretty much a production or invention of what the CIA and like the intelligence agencies have been trying to do for the past few decades. But yeah, I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that was really a hell of an ad. Everybody should watch that. Yeah, woke warriors are coming out in the open. Right. I think that's it for comments for now. Emily said she had to leave because of some landlord inspection.
Okay.
We're at one almost 1:30.
I think we should throw in the towel.
Oh right.
It's been intense.
Not throwing in the towel, just
Not throwing in the towel. I don't know. Well, as they say, go to eat lunch.
Yeah, that's all right. Well, I think we had a great, really fantastic discussion and beautiful presentation today. I think we've tackled a lot of important issues. So thanks everybody who joined us on the panel. Of course, Doc, as always, thank you for that clarity. And thanks everybody who joined us on the live stream. We'll be here same time next week. Goodbye.